Tonight, we're diving into a quiet question from the world of Dune, one about warriors and reputation, about who is truly the deadliest of all. For thousands of years, the Sardaukar, the terrible soldier fanatics of the Padishah Emperor, were believed to be the finest fighting force in the known universe, and their very name spread fear across 1,000 worlds. And yet, on a single desert planet, there lived a people the whole Imperium had overlooked, a people who would prove, in the end, to be something greater still. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters we will explore, without haste, how the Sardaukar were forged and feared, and how the Fremen of Arrakis, hardened by their desert and their discipline, became the true masters of war and broken empire. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide across the dunes, and let it carry you, softly, down towards sleep. There is a name that once moved through the corridors of power like a cold draft, and that name was Sardaukar. Across the 1,000 worlds of the known universe, across the great spread of the Imperium and its countless suns, the Sardaukar were spoken of as the deadliest soldiers ever to walk beneath the stars. They were the soldier fanatics of the Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV of House Carino, and for many long centuries they were believed, without serious question, to be the finest fighting force in all of creation. Tonight, we begin gently with them, with the shadow they cast and the dread they carried, and we will let their story unfold slowly, the way a long night unfolds toward morning. To understand the fear they inspired, imagine first the size of the Imperium itself. It was not a single kingdom or a single world, but a vast web of planets bound together across unimaginable distances, ruled from a golden throne by an emperor whose word could reshape the fate of whole peoples. Beneath him stood the great houses of the Landsraad, the noble families who governed their own worlds and held their own armies, proud and ancient and often jealous of one another. And above all of them, quietly, patiently, stood the Sardaukar, the emperor's own troops, the sword he never needed to draw more than once for its edge to be remembered. They dressed in gray, and the plainness of that gray was itself a kind of warning. Where other soldiers wore bright colors and the shining crests of their houses, the Sardaukar wore the muted uniforms of men who had no need to impress anyone. Their gray and black spoke not of pageantry, but of purpose. When they appeared upon a field or in a hall, they did not announce themselves with banners and trumpets. They simply arrived, in ordered ranks, moving with a calm and terrible discipline. And the sight of that plain gray advancing was often enough to still the heart of anyone who understood what it meant. For the great families of the Imperium knew the stories, and the stories were not kind. It was said that a handful of Sardaukar could stand against many times their number and prevail. It was said that they fought with a ferocity that ordinary soldiers could not sustain, and with a coldness that no ordinary soldier could match. They were trained past the point where fear could reach them, or so the legend held, and they gave no ground and asked for no mercy and offered none in return. The armies of the great houses were not weak. Many of them were disciplined, well-equipped, and led by capable men. Yet again and again, in the reckoning of the Imperium, the measure of any force was taken against the Sardaukar, and against the Sardaukar most forces were found wanting. The reputation had been built across generations, in a long series of demonstrations that the Imperium did not forget. It was a reputation older than any lord now living, passed down like an inheritance from father to son among the noble houses, so that even those who had never seen a Sardaukar with their own eyes carried within them a settled certainty about what such soldiers could do. Wherever a world had risen in rebellion, wherever a house had grown too bold or a governor too ambitious, the emperor before Shaddam and the emperor before him could send the gray ranks to settle the matter. The outcomes were remembered less for their details than for their certainty. The Sardaukar came, and order returned, and the lesson was quietly absorbed by every family that heard of it. In this way, the fear became self-sustaining. The soldiers did not need to fight often, because the memory of their fighting did the work for them. A threat that never has to be carried out is, in some ways, the most powerful threat of all, and the emperor understood this well. There was, too, a quality in the Sardaukar that went beyond skill or numbers, and it was perhaps the most unsettling quality of them all. They were loyal in a way that seemed almost beyond nature. They did not serve the emperor for gold, nor for land, nor for the ordinary rewards that move ordinary men. They served him as though their whole being had been bent toward that single purpose from the very beginning, as though loyalty had been poured into them and set hard like stone. This was not the loyalty of a paid soldier who might waver, nor of a levied man who dreams of going home. It was something deeper and stranger, a devotion so complete that it made them, in the eyes of the Imperium, less like an army and more like an extension of the Emperor's own will. Thousands of hands moving to a single thought, and so their name carried a weight far heavier than steel. When ambassadors gathered in the great halls of the Landsraad, when the heads of proud houses met to weigh their quarrels and their schemes, there was always, unspoken, a certain limit beyond which no one dared to press. Every calculation of power in the Imperium included, somewhere in its quiet arithmetic, the gray ranks of Salusa Secundus. A house might grow rich, a house might grow clever, a house might gather ships and men and allies and dream of rising higher than its station allowed. But behind every such dream stood the same cold fact, and the fact wore gray and did not smile. To move against the emperor was to invite the Sardaukar, and to invite the Sardaukar was, in the common wisdom of the age, to invite the end. It is worth pausing here, in the hush of this telling, to notice how strange and how fragile such a thing truly is. An entire order of stars, an imperium of 1,000 worlds, rested in part upon the reputation of a single body of soldiers, not upon their numbers alone, for they were not the largest force in the universe, and not upon their weapons alone, for others had weapons as fine. It rested upon belief, upon the shared conviction that these men could not be beaten. Belief is a powerful thing, and it can hold up a mountain of power for a very long time. Yet belief, unlike stone, can be tested, and what is tested can sometimes be found to have edges and limits that no one had thought to look for. For now, though, in the long centuries before our story turns, the belief held firm. The Sardaukar were the terror of the Imperium, and the Imperium slept, in its uneasy way, beneath their shadow. The great houses schemed and traded and married and warred among themselves in the small permitted ways, and always they kept one careful eye upon the gray soldiers of the Emperor, and always they measured their boldness against that gray. The name alone could quiet a room. The name alone could bend a proud lord's plans, and few who spoke that name ever stopped to wonder where such soldiers came from, or what dark and distant place had shaped them into the thing the universe feared. That is the question we will follow now, slowly and without hurry, as the room grows softer around you and the story settles in. For the Sardaukar were not born of the Emperor's palace, nor raised in comfort upon the gentle worlds of the core. They were forged, quite deliberately, upon a world so cruel that its very name was a punishment, a place where the Imperium sent those it wished to forget, and where something far more dangerous than forgetting was quietly at work. The The terror of 1,000 worlds had a birthplace, and the birthplace was a prison. Up next in Chapter 2, Salusa Secundus, the prison planet, we will travel to that harsh and distant world and see the burning skies and broken lands where the Emperor's most feared soldiers first learned to survive. We will discover how a place meant only for suffering became, in secret, the training ground that gave the Imperium its deadliest weapon, and how cruelty itself was made to serve the throne. Rest easy now, and let the sands of that far world drift slowly into view. Far from the gentle worlds of the Imperium's heart, out where the light of a harsh sun fell upon broken ground, there turned a planet whose very name was spoken as a kind of sentence, Salusa Secundus. To be sent there was to be cast out of the ordinary world of the living into a place designed for suffering and forgetting. And yet this same planet, this ruined and pitiless world, was the secret cradle of the Emperor's most feared soldiers. Tonight we journey there in the softest way, watching from a safe and distant remove, letting its story settle over us slowly like dust drifting down through still air. Salusa Secundus had not always been a place of desolation. Long ages before our story, it had been the throne world of House Carino, the seat of the Imperium itself, a jewel among planets. But a terrible catastrophe had fallen upon it, a great burning that scarred its surface and poisoned its lands and drove the imperial house to seek a new home among the stars. What remained was a world of hard extremes, of blistering days and bitter nights, of dry plains and cracked stone and skies that could turn cruel without warning. The gentle balance that makes a world kind to living things had been broken there, and in its place stood a landscape that seemed to test every breath a creature took. Because it had become so harsh, the Imperium found a use for it, and the use was grim. Salusa Secundus became a prison planet, a place to send the worst offenders, the condemned, the dangerous, the ones the Imperium wished to be rid of. It was not a prison of walls and locked doors in the ordinary sense. The planet itself was the prison. Its climate was the jailer, its wastelands the bars, its scarcity of food and water and shelter the chains that held the condemned in place. There was little need for guards, where the very air and ground conspired to kill. To be sent to Salusa Secundus was, for most, understood to be a slow sentence of death, and the Imperium was content to let it be seen that way. The conditions there were brutal beyond easy telling. The sun beat down without pity upon those who had no shade, and the nights stole away the day's heat until the cold gnawed at the bones. Water was rare and precious, and the land yielded little to those who tried to draw life from it. Storms could rise and scour the plains. The dangers of the world did not rest, and neither could those who wished to survive it. In such a place, the ordinary comforts of life fell away entirely, and existence became a single, unbroken labor of staying alive from one hour to the next. And here we come to the terrible secret at the heart of that world, the thing the Imperium understood and used with cold deliberation. Salusa Secundus killed the weak. Year after year, generation after generation, its cruelty pressed upon every living soul within it, and those who could not endure did not endure. The old, the frail, the unlucky, the ones whose spirit broke or whose bodies failed, were carried away by the world itself, quietly and without ceremony. What remained after such long and merciless sorting were the strongest, the hardest, the most cunning and resilient. The planet performed, without meaning to and without mercy, a kind of terrible sifting, and from that sifting emerged human beings tempered to an edge that no gentle world could ever produce. It was estimated, in the grim reckoning of the Imperium, that of every 13 souls sent or born upon that world, only a portion would live to grow strong within it. The rest were lost to the heat, the cold, the hunger, the violence, and the thousand small deaths that such a place holds. But those who lived, those who came through the long sifting, were changed by it. They were harder than other people, quicker, more watchful, more willing to endure what others could not. They had learned survival not from lessons, but from necessity, in the only school where failure meant an ending. And in this hard population, the emperor found the raw material for his legend. For the Padishah emperor and his house understood something that the great families of the Landsraad often overlooked. They understood that a world which breeds survivors breeds soldiers, if only the survivors can be gathered, disciplined, and turned toward a purpose. Salusa Secundus was left in its ruin, not merely because the Imperium had abandoned it, but because its ruin was useful. The very cruelty that made it a prison made it also a forge, and so the planet was kept as it was, a place of punishment on its surface, and a secret armory beneath that surface, hidden in plain view behind the mask of a mere prison world. The great houses knew that the Sardaukar came from Salusa Secundus, but few of them truly understood what that meant. They imagined, perhaps, some grand academy, some ordered institution of drill and training, and in part they were not wrong, for training there certainly was. Yet the deeper truth was harder and stranger. The first and most important lesson of the Sardaukar was taught not by any instructor, but by the planet itself, before ever a hand was raised to teach them the arts of war. The survivors of Salusa Secundus had already been taught the deepest lesson a soldier can learn, which is how to keep living when the whole world seems set upon your death, and how to feel no surprise at hardship, because hardship is all you have ever known. There is a quiet and sobering wisdom hidden in this, and it is worth resting upon for a moment as the story slows. Strength of a certain kind is not given but earned, and it is often earned in places that no one would ever choose. The people of that world did not read of hardship in books or hear of it in distant tales, for hardship was the very air they breathed from their first waking moment to their last. What other peoples called courage was to them only the ordinary business of living, and what other peoples called endurance was to them merely another name for the passing of an ordinary day. The people shaped upon that scarred world did not ask to be shaped. They were simply born into pitilessness, or cast into it, and those who endured carried the mark of that endurance in everything they did. It made them formidable. It also made them, in a way we will come to understand as our tale unfolds, narrower and harder than the fullest kind of strength allows. But that is a thread for later chapters, and we need not pull upon it yet. For now, it is enough to see the planet clearly, turning in the dark, its ruined plains stretching away beneath a merciless sky. It is enough to see that the terror of 1,000 worlds was not born in any palace of gold, but here, in this forgotten place of exile and death. The gray ranks that made the emperor mighty, the soldiers whose very name could quiet a hall of proud lords, first opened their eyes upon a world that promised them nothing but struggle. And out of that struggle, generation upon generation, the Imperium drew its sharpest instrument, and few ever paused to ask what such a beginning does to the soul of an army. We have seen the forge. Now we must watch the forging itself, the deliberate work that took the survivors of Salusa Secundus and shaped them, step by careful step, into the fanatical warriors the universe feared. For surviving a cruel world is one thing, and becoming a Sardaukar is another, and between the two lay a long and severe making. Up next in Chapter 3, How the Sardaukar Are Made, we will follow that making closely, from the hardened children of the prison world to the disciplined and devoted soldiers of the throne. We will see how savagery and order were braided together, and how loyalty so complete it seemed unbreakable was slowly and deliberately poured into them. Let your breathing slow now, and let the harsh world settle into stillness as we turn toward the making of the legend. We have seen the harsh world that gave the Sardaukar their beginning, and now we turn, gently and without alarm, to the making of the soldiers themselves. For it is one thing to survive a cruel planet, and quite another to be shaped into the most feared warriors in the Imperium. Between those two things lay a long and deliberate process, patient and severe, and tonight we will follow it slowly, watching from a calm distance as the raw endurance of Salusa Secundus was turned, step by careful step, into the gray legend of the throne. It began, as so much did on that world, in childhood. Among the survivors of the prison planet there were children, some born there into hardship, some brought there in the great movements of the condemned, and all of them growing up in a place that punished every weakness. From their earliest years, these children knew a world without softness. They learned before they could reason that comfort was not to be expected, and that safety was something a person made for themselves, hour by hour, through watchfulness and effort. The gentleness that surrounds a child on a kinder world simply did not exist for them. In its place stood a constant, quiet lesson taught by the planet itself, that life is a struggle, and that only the strong and the careful continue. Out of this population of hardened children, the Emperor's servants drew their recruits. The strongest, the quickest, the most resilient were gathered and set upon a path of training that built upon everything the world had already taught them. Where an ordinary army must first teach a soft recruit to endure discomfort, the makers of the Sardaukar began with young people who had never known anything else. Endurance did not have to be instilled in them, for it was already the very ground of their being, and so the training could reach at once toward things that other armies could never quite achieve, because it was not fighting against comfort, but building upon a foundation of survival already laid. The making was harsh, and there is no gentle way to describe its severity, though we will speak of it softly and turn our eyes from its worst edges. The young Sardaukar were raised in an atmosphere that braided together two things which might seem opposed: savagery and discipline. On one hand, they were hardened further still, pressed to their limits and beyond, taught to give and endure hardship without flinching, shaped into people for whom pain and danger held no power to unsettle. On the other hand, they were bound by an iron order, a discipline so complete that it governed their every movement, their formations, their bearing, the very way they held themselves in stillness and in motion. The wildness of the survivor and the order of the soldier were fused together in them until neither could be separated from the other. This was the secret of their fearsomeness. Many armies have discipline, and many fighters have ferocity, but rarely are the two joined so completely in the same person. A merely fierce warrior can be undone by chaos, breaking ranks in the heat of passion. A merely disciplined soldier can be broken by terror, his order dissolving when the horror of battle grows too great. But the Sardaukar were made to hold both at once, to unleash a controlled savagery that never lost its shape, to fight with the fury of the desperate and the precision of the drilled. It made them, in the reckoning of the Imperium, something close to unstoppable. An army that could neither be frightened into disorder nor tempted into recklessness. Yet the deepest and strangest part of their making was not the hardening of their bodies, nor the sharpening of their skills, but the shaping of their spirit toward a single devotion. The Sardaukar were made to be utterly loyal to the Emperor, loyal past reason, loyal past the ordinary bonds that hold soldiers to a cause. This loyalty was not left to chance. It was cultivated with the same deliberate care as their strength, poured into them across the long years of their making until it became the very center of who they were. They came to see themselves not as men who served an emperor by choice, but as beings whose entire purpose was the throne, as though loyalty were not a decision they had made, but a truth they had been born to embody. There was a kind of faith in it, a fervor that went beyond soldiering into something almost like religion. The Sardaukar were fanatics, and the word is used with care, for their devotion had the quality of belief rather than mere allegiance. They did not weigh the emperor's commands against their own interests, because they had been shaped to have no interests apart from his. They did not fear death in the ordinary way, because death in his service had been made to seem, to them, the fitting completion of their purpose, rather than a thing to be avoided. An army that does not fear death and does not question its master is a terrible instrument, and this the Imperium had built, quite deliberately, out of the survivors of a prison world. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this telling, to feel the strange sorrow that lies beneath such a making. These were human beings, after all, children once, who might have grown toward any number of lives had they been born elsewhere. Instead, they were gathered from a world of suffering and shaped, with cold intention, into a single purpose that was not their own. Their strength was real, and their skill was real, and the fear they inspired was well earned. But it was a strength grown in a narrow channel, a devotion given not freely, but instilled. And there is something in that narrowness, which, as our story will show, held the seed of a weakness the Imperium never thought to fear. For a devotion that is poured into a person from outside is a powerful thing, but it is also a made thing, and made things have their limits. The Sardaukar fought for the Emperor because they had been shaped to know nothing else, and this made them formidable against any enemy who fought merely for pay or duty, or the ordinary loyalties of the great houses. But there exists another kind of strength in the universe, one that is not poured into a people, but grows up naturally from their own lives, from their own land, from a purpose that is truly and wholly their own. Against that deeper kind of strength, the made devotion of the Sardaukar would one day be measured, and the measuring would reveal much. But that reckoning lies far ahead, in the sands of another world, and we need not hasten toward it. For now, let us simply see the finished work of the forge. Out of the cruel sorting of Salusa Secundus, out of the hardened children and the disciplined recruits, out of the braiding of savagery and order, and the careful cultivation of an unbreakable seeming loyalty, the Imperium had made its soldiers. They stepped forth in their plain gray, calm and terrible, fearing nothing, questioning nothing, ready to go wherever the throne should send them. The legend the universe feared was not born, but built. Piece by deliberate piece, in a place of suffering, and the building was complete. And so the question turns naturally from what they were to what they did, or rather to what their existence did to the whole vast order of the Imperium. For a weapon such as this is never merely a weapon. It reshapes everything around it, bending the plans and fears and ambitions of every power that knows of it. The Sardaukar did not need to march to change the Imperium. Their very existence, quietly known and deeply feared, held 1,000 worlds in a careful stillness. Up next, in Chapter 4, the fear they cast across the Imperium, we will see how the dread of these soldiers spread across the great houses of the Landsraad, and how the knowledge that the Emperor could unleash them kept the proud and the powerful in check. We will watch fear itself become a tool of rule. Let your thoughts grow soft and slow now, and let the story carry you onward toward that quiet, watchful peace. We have watched the Sardaukar being made, forged from the survivors of a cruel world into disciplined and devoted soldiers. Now we turn to the shadow they cast, the long and quiet fear that spread from them across the whole of the Imperium. For an army such as this does its greatest work not upon the battlefield, but in the minds of those who might one day oppose it. Tonight, we will follow that fear as it moved, unseen and unspoken, through the halls of the great houses, and see how the Emperor made dread itself into an instrument of rule. To understand this, we must remember the shape of the Imperium and the delicate balance upon which it rested. It was not a simple empire ruled by a single, unquestioned hand. The Padishah Emperor sat upon the golden throne, yes, but around him stood the great houses of the Landsraad, the noble families who governed their own worlds, commanded their own fleets, and held their own armies. Together these houses were powerful, and had they ever united against the throne, their combined might would have been vast beyond the Emperor's own. The Imperium was, in a sense, a careful arrangement among rivals, a balance held in place by law and custom and the long habit of order. Yet the balance leaned always toward the throne, and the reason it leaned was the Sardaukar. The great houses knew that no matter how their own strength grew, the Emperor held in reserve a force that could not be matched by any single family. A house might raise a fine army, well-trained and well-equipped, and still it would understand, in the quiet arithmetic of power, that its army was not the equal of the gray ranks of Salusa Secundus. This knowledge sat at the heart of every calculation the noble families made. It was the weight upon the scale that kept the whole arrangement from tipping into open struggle. The fear worked precisely because it so rarely needed to be proven. The Emperor did not send his Sardaukar marching from world to world to remind the houses of their power. He did not need to. The memory of what those soldiers could do, gathered over long generations of demonstrations, did the work for him. When the lords of the Landsraad gathered to weigh their quarrels and their ambitions, the Sardaukar were present in every mind, though absent from every hall, a silent third party to every negotiation. A house might press its advantage against a rival, might scheme and maneuver in the permitted games of imperial politics, but always there was a line beyond which no one dared to step, and that line was drawn by the gray soldiers of the throne. Consider how powerful such a thing truly is. A ruler who must constantly use force to hold his power is, in a sense, a weak ruler, for his strength is always being spent and always being tested. But a ruler whose mere reputation keeps his rivals in check spends nothing and risks little. The Emperor held his 1,000 worlds in a great stillness, not by endless war, but by the settled certainty, shared among all the houses, that war against the throne would end in ruin. This is the strange and quiet power of dread. It rules through what might happen rather than through what does, and so long as no one dares to test it, it can hold an entire order of stars in a firm and lasting peace. And so the fear became woven into the very fabric of the Imperium. It shaped the marriages of the great houses, who bound themselves in alliances, always mindful of the throne's overwhelming reserve. It shaped their trade and their rivalries, their boldness and their caution. Ambitious lords, who might have dreamed of climbing higher than their station, learned to keep such dreams small and quiet, for the path upward was blocked by a fact that wore gray and did not yield. The whole political order of 1,000 worlds bent itself, subtly and constantly, around the knowledge of what the Emperor could unleash, and few dared even to speak openly of that knowledge, for to speak of it was to admit how completely it governed them. There was a wisdom in this arrangement that served the Emperor well for a very long time, and there was also a hidden fragility in it, though few could see the fragility while the fear held firm. The wisdom was that peace held cheaply, kept by reputation rather than by ceaseless struggle. But the fragility lay in the very nature of dread, for dread depends entirely upon belief. The Sardaukar held the imperium in check, not because every house had tested them and been defeated, but because every house believed they could not be defeated. Such belief is strong, far stronger than it might seem, and it can hold up an empire for centuries. Yet belief is not the same as truth, and what rests upon belief can stand only so long as the belief remains unbroken. For the moment, though, in the long years of Shaddam IV and the emperors before him, the belief stood unshaken, and the fear did its patient work. The great houses schemed among themselves in the small ways that were permitted, and always they measured their daring against the gray soldiers of the throne, and always they found reasons to hold back. A proud lord might rage in private at the limits placed upon his house, might dream of a day when the arrangement might be overturned, but when the moment came to act, the same cold fact would rise before him, and the same cautious wisdom would counsel patience. The Sardaukar did not have to lift a hand to defeat such dreams. Their reputation defeated them first, quietly, in the minds of the very men who dreamed them. It is worth resting for a moment upon how much of imperial power was, in the end, a matter of the mind. The emperor's throne was upheld by ships and law and wealth and alliance, but beneath all of these lay something less solid and more powerful still. A shared conviction spread across 1,000 worlds that the throne could not be beaten. The Sardaukar were the living heart of that conviction. So long as no people, no house, no force in all the Imperium could stand against them and prevail, the conviction held, and the peace held with it, and the emperor slept securely upon his golden seat. Yet here, in the quiet of this telling, we may begin to feel the faint outline of the question that will carry our whole story forward. If the power of the Imperium rested upon the belief that the Sardaukar could not be beaten, then everything depended upon that belief remaining true. And beliefs, however old and however deep, can be tested. Somewhere in the vast Imperium, though no one yet suspected it, there might exist a people whose strength had grown in a channel deeper than any prison world could carve. A people who fought not from an instilled devotion, but from the marrow of their own lives. Should such a people ever meet the gray ranks upon a field, the question long thought settled would be asked anew, and the answer might shake 1,000 worlds. But that meeting lies far ahead, upon the sands of a world we have not yet visited, and we need not rush toward it. For now, it is enough to see the fear in its full strength, holding the Imperium quiet, keeping the proud houses in their places, making the emperor mighty through dread alone. The Sardaukar were the terror that ruled without ruling, the silent weight upon every scale, and the whole vast order of the stars rested, more than anyone cared to admit, upon their fearsome name. Up next in Chapter 5, The Balance of Power They Kept, we will look more closely at that delicate arrangement, at how no single house could rival the emperor while he held such soldiers, and how the entire political order of the Imperium rested quietly upon their reputation. We will see the careful equilibrium of 1,000 worlds and begin to sense how much depended upon a single unbroken belief. Let yourself grow still and calm now, and drift gently onward into that quiet balance. To understand the Imperium of 10,000 years, you must first understand that it was held together not only by law and not only by trade, but by a quiet and constant weighing of strength against strength. It was a vast and delicate arrangement, older than the memory of any living person, and it rested, in the end, upon the reputation of a single army. The Padishah Emperor sat upon the Golden Lion throne, and around him turned the great houses of the Landsraad, each with its own worlds, its own soldiers, its own pride. And yet not one of them, not the richest, not the proudest, not the most ancient, could ever hope to stand alone against the man who commanded the Sardaukar. This was the balance of power they kept, and tonight we will move through it gently, the way one walks through a still hall at evening, noticing how everything has been placed just so. Consider first the shape of that empire. There were the great houses, called the houses major, who held whole planets as their fiefs. There were the lesser houses beneath them, and beneath those the countless families and factions that filled the worlds of humankind. Together these houses formed the Landsraad, a great assembly, an ancient council that gave them a single voice when they chose to raise it. In theory, the Landsraad could check even the emperor, for together the houses commanded more soldiers, more ships, and more wealth than the imperial throne alone. In theory, if they ever truly united, they could set aside any ruler who displeased them. And so the imperium was not the rule of one man over many, but a careful triangle of three powers leaning against one another, each holding the others in place. The first power was the emperor himself, House Carino, with his throne world and his terrible soldiers. The second was the Landsraad, the massed strength of all the great houses together. And the third, quiet and patient, was the Spacing Guild, which held the monopoly on travel between the stars, for only the guild could fold space and carry ships safely across the great dark. No house could move an army from one world to another without the guild, and so the guild sat above the quarrels of men, selling passage to all and taking sides with none. These three leaned together, and their leaning was the peace of the imperium. But a triangle is only stable while each of its sides holds firm, and the side that mattered most, the side that kept the emperor's corner from being overwhelmed, was the Sardaukar. For here was the heart of it. The Landsraad, all the great houses gathered as one, could in raw numbers field more fighting men than the emperor. If every house emptied its garrisons and marched together, the throne would surely fall. And yet the houses did not march together, and could not. And the reason was the Sardaukar. Each single house, standing alone, knew that its own soldiers could not match the emperor's terror troops. One Sardaukar was reckoned the equal of 10 ordinary Landsraad conscripts, and often more. So no house dared move first, for the house that rose alone would be crushed alone, made an example of before the others could gather the will to act. This was the genius of the arrangement, and its quiet cruelty. The emperor did not need an army large enough to defeat all the houses at once. He needed only an army fearsome enough that no house believed it could win the first battle. Fear did the rest. Each house watched its neighbors, wondering who might rise, knowing that whoever rose first would draw the gray uniforms down upon them, and knowing, too, that the other houses, cautious and self-interested, would likely stand aside and let it happen rather than share the danger. And so, the houses were held apart from one another by their own prudence, 1,000 strong hands that could never quite close into a single fist. The number of the Sardaukar was itself a kind of secret, spoken of but never truly known, and this uncertainty served the throne well. Were there a few legions, or many? Could the emperor field them all at once, or only a portion? No house could be certain, and in that uncertainty every house imagined the worst. A power that is fully counted can be measured and met. A power left in shadow grows in the mind until it fills every fear, and the Sardaukar lived in that shadow, larger in imagination than they could ever be in the field. Yet the balance had its own hidden limits, and these too are worth noticing, softly, as we go. The emperor could not simply destroy a great house whenever he wished, for the Landsraad, though slow to unite, would not tolerate the naked murder of one of its own. There were forms to be observed, ancient customs of war and honor, rules that governed how a house might be challenged or brought low. If the emperor were seen to strike down a house without cause and without cover, the other houses might at last feel the cold breath of their own mortality, and in that fear find the unity they otherwise lacked. So the throne, for all its terrible soldiers, moved carefully. Its power depended on the houses remaining divided, and the surest way to unite them would be to frighten them all at once. The Sardaukar were a blade the emperor could not draw too openly, lest the sight of it turn every house against him together. And so the whole vast order rested, quietly, upon a reputation. The peace of 10,000 worlds, the security of the throne, the caution of the houses, all of it leaned upon the belief that the Sardaukar could not be beaten. Not upon a wall, not upon a fleet, not upon anything that could be seen and counted, but upon a belief, carried in the minds of proud and frightened men across 1,000 years. As long as that belief held, the Imperium held. Every ambitious lord who dreamed of the throne measured his dream against the gray soldiers and set it aside. Every rivalry between houses stopped short of open war, because open war invited the emperor's judgment, and his judgment came wearing gray. There is something almost restful in how still it all was, this great machine of fear that hummed so quietly that most of its people never heard it at all. Farmers on distant worlds lived and died without ever seeing a Sardaukar. Merchants traded, ships folded space, children were born and grew old, and above them all the balance held, invisible as gravity, holding the pieces in their places. The soldiers themselves were rarely needed. That was the strange truth at the center of their power. An army whose reputation is perfect need almost never fight, for its victories are won in the minds of those who will not challenge it. The Sardaukar kept the peace of the Imperium mostly by existing, by being imagined, by being feared. But a peace built on fear is a peace that lasts only so long as the fear is never tested and found wanting. A reputation, however vast, is a fragile thing, for it lives entirely in the beliefs of others, and beliefs can change in a single afternoon. Should the day ever come when the Sardaukar were truly matched, when someone somewhere proved that the gray soldiers could bleed and break like any other men, then the whole balance would begin to tremble. The houses would look at one another with new eyes. The uncertainty that had kept them still would give way to a different and more dangerous thought. And the emperor, who had ruled so long upon a belief, would find that beliefs, once broken, are very hard to mend. That day was still far off, and the balance still held, quiet and complete. But even in that stillness, the seeds of its undoing were already being sown. And they would be sown, of all places, upon a rich and troubled world, in the fall of a single noble house. Up next in Chapter 6, The Fall of House Atreides, we'll follow how the Emperor turned his terrible soldiers against a single duke, and how that dark and quiet betrayal, meant as a demonstration of his power, became the first seed of everything that would one day undo him. Now we come to the night when the balance of power was quietly used, not to keep the peace, but to destroy a house that had grown too admired. This is the story of the fall of House Atreides, and though it is a story of treachery and fire, we will move through it slowly and gently, the way one recalls a distant sorrow long grown soft with time. There is nothing here for you to carry. It happened long ago, in a world of story, and we only visit it to understand how the Emperor's terrible soldiers were turned, in secret, against a single noble duke. House Atreides was among the great houses of the Landsraad, an old and honorable line, and at its head stood Duke Leto, called by many the Red Duke. He was a ruler of a kind that is rare in any age. He was just where he might have been cruel, generous where he might have been grasping, and beloved by the people who served him. His soldiers followed him not merely out of duty, but out of devotion, and his name was spoken with respect across the Imperium. He held the ocean world of Caladan, green and gentle, a place of water and mist and old stone. And there his house had ruled in quiet strength for many generations. And this, strangely, was the danger. For the Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV, watching from his throne, saw in Duke Leto something that troubled him. Here was a man whose reputation was growing, whose leadership drew loyalty as a lamp draws moths, whose voice in the Landsraad carried further each year. The Atreides were building something the Emperor had learned to fear. Not an army greater than his own, but a name that other houses admired and might one day rally around. In the careful balance we spoke of before, a house that becomes too beloved is as dangerous as a house that becomes too strong, for love, like fear, can unite the scattered houses into a single will. And so the Emperor decided, coldly and quietly, that House Atreides must be brought down. But he could not simply send his gray soldiers openly against Duke Leto. To do so would be to break the very forms that held the Imperium together, to show every other house that the throne would murder its own without cover or cause. That was the one thing the balance could not survive. So the Emperor devised a subtler cruelty, a plan that would destroy the Atreides while leaving his own hand hidden. He would use the ancient enemies of House Atreides to carry the blame, and he would lend them his soldiers in secret to make certain the deed was done. The ancient enemies of the Atreides were House Harkonnen, a house as dark as the Atreides were bright. Where Leto ruled by loyalty, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen ruled by fear and appetite, and between the two houses lay a feud older than either man, a wound that had never healed. The Harkonnens hungered for the ruin of the Atreides with a patience that had waited generations. And so the Emperor found in the Baron a willing instrument, and the two of them, throne and enemy, bent their heads together over the destruction of a single good man. The trap was baited with a gift. The Emperor commanded that House Atreides leave their green world of Caladan and take up the governorship of Arrakis, the desert planet, the only source in all the universe of the spice melange. To all appearances, this was a great honor, for Arrakis was the richest fief in the Imperium, and to hold it was to hold the source of the most precious substance known to humankind. But it was a poisoned honor. The Harkonnens had ruled Arrakis for 80 years and knew every tunnel and secret of it, while the Atreides would arrive as strangers on a hostile world, stretched thin and far from the strength of their home. Duke Leto saw the danger plainly. He understood that the gift was a trap, that he was being drawn out into the open where he could be destroyed. And yet, he could not refuse the Emperor's command without declaring himself a rebel. So he went, with his eyes open, into the desert. For a time the Atreides worked to make Arrakis their own. They sought the friendship of the native desert people, they labored to win the loyalty of the world, and slowly they began to build the very strength the Emperor feared. But the trap had already closed around them. The Baron had planted a traitor within the household of Duke Leto, a trusted man turned by threats against one he loved. And through this betrayal, the Atreides' shields were lowered on the night of the attack. And then the Grey Soldiers came. The Emperor had lent the Baron a great force of Sardaukar, and here is the heart of the deception. They did not come as themselves. They came dressed in the uniforms of House Harkonnen, their gray set aside for Harkonnen colors, so that any who saw them fall upon the Atreides would believe they saw only Harkonnen troops, only the old feud playing out its bloody end. In this disguise, the Emperor's terrible soldiers descended upon the city of Arrakis in the dark, joined by the massed legions of the Baron, and they fell upon a house already betrayed from within. The Atreides fought as men who loved their duke, and they fought well, and it was not enough. They had been outnumbered and outmaneuvered, their defenses opened by treachery, their world unfamiliar beneath their feet. They had come to the desert as strangers, and the desert gave them no shelter, and the shields that should have guarded them fell silent one by one in the dark. Against them stood not only the strength of their ancient enemy, but the finest soldiers in the universe, wearing another house's colors. The fighting was swift, and it was terrible, and by the end of that night, House Atreides had fallen. Duke Leto himself was taken, and he died a captive, and the green banner of his house was pulled down from the walls of Arrakis. To the watching Imperium, it appeared to be a private tragedy, the last chapter of an ancient feud, a strong house brought low by an older enemy. The Emperor's hand remained hidden. The Sardaukar had done their work and vanished back into their gray, and no proof pointed to the throne. It seemed a perfect crime, and for the Emperor, it was meant to be a demonstration, quiet and complete, of what he could do to any house that grew too beloved. Let the others see how quickly the admired Atreides had fallen. Let them learn, without ever being told, that the throne could reach anyone. And yet, in the very completeness of that victory, something had been set in motion that the Emperor could not see. 2 of the Atreides had escaped into the desert on that night of fire. The Duke's concubine, the Lady Jessica, and their young son Paul, cast out from the ruin of their house, hunted and alone, they fled into the vast and burning sands, into the one part of Arrakis that neither Harkonnen nor Emperor truly ruled. They fled toward the desert people, the very people the Atreides had tried to befriend. And in that flight, the seed of everything to come was planted. For the Emperor had used his most terrible soldiers to prove his power, and in proving it, he had driven the last of the Atreides into the arms of the only people in the Imperium hard enough to one day break the Sardaukar. The demonstration of imperial strength had become, without anyone yet knowing it, the first move in the throne's own undoing. The gray soldiers had won a battle and lit, in the deep desert, a fire that would in time consume an empire. Up next in Chapter 7, the first cracks in the legend, we'll notice the earliest hints that the Sardaukar's supremacy was not as absolute as the Imperium believed, and that somewhere upon the sands of Arrakis, a harder people waited to test it. A legend, when it is young and untested, seems as solid as stone. But every legend has its hidden seams, the quiet places where it was never quite as perfect as the telling made it seem. And if you look softly and patiently, you can find them long before they open. Tonight we go looking, gently, for the first cracks in the legend of the Sardaukar. Not the great breaking that would come later upon the sands, but the small and early hints that their supremacy was never truly absolute, and that somewhere in the Imperium, a harder people waited, who might one day test the throne's confidence and find it wanting. The first crack was one the Emperor himself understood, though he did not speak of it. The Sardaukar were not endless. They were forged upon a single world, Salusa Secundus, and that forging was slow and costly and could not be hurried. A house may raise ordinary soldiers by the million, drilling farmers into ranks in a season, but the Sardaukar were made across years by a world that killed most of those it took. Their strength was their scarcity, and their scarcity was also their weakness. Every one of them that fell was a loss that could not be quickly replaced. An army that cannot afford to lose is an army that must never be tested too hard, and the Emperor knew, quietly, that his terrible soldiers were fewer than the Imperium imagined and more precious than he could ever admit. The legend spoke of an inexhaustible gray tide. The truth was a finite and irreplaceable thing, guarded as carefully as any treasure. The second crack lay in the very source of their hardness. The Sardaukar were forged by cruelty upon a prison world, And cruelty makes a certain kind of soldier fierce and disciplined and loyal. But over the long centuries of their supremacy, that discipline had begun, in small ways, to soften. For the truth was that the Sardaukar had grown accustomed to winning. Battle after battle they had faced ordinary troops who broke before them, houses that surrendered at the mere sight of the gray uniforms, enemies half beaten by fear before a single blow was struck, and an army that always wins, that is always feared, that is never truly matched, slowly loses something without noticing its loss. It grows confident. It grows comfortable in its own legend. It comes to believe the stories told about it, and belief in one's own invincibility is the softest and most dangerous cushion a warrior can rest upon. There is a hard truth beneath this, and it is worth holding for a moment in the quiet. The Sardaukar were shaped by a brutal world, but they no longer lived upon it. They were carried across the stars in comfort, fed and equipped by the wealth of an empire, sent to fight and then withdrawn to rest. The forge that made them was Salusa Secundus, but the men themselves spent their lives far from that forge, in barracks and troop ships, in the service of a throne that valued them and kept them well. And so, generation by generation, an unseen distance had opened between the Sardaukar and the source of their strength. They carried the reputation of the death planet, but they no longer lived its daily death. They were fierce, but their fierceness had become a thing remembered and rehearsed rather than a thing endured fresh each morning. Compare this, softly, to a people who were never allowed to grow comfortable at all. Somewhere in the Imperium, the Emperor and his advisors had begun to notice a strange and troubling pattern, though they did not yet understand it. It came from Arrakis, the desert world, the very planet at the center of the fall of House Atreides. For generations, the Harkonnens who ruled Arrakis had waged a quiet war against the native desert people, the Fremen, and for generations that war had gone strangely. The Harkonnens sent their soldiers into the deep desert to hunt the Fremen, and the soldiers did not come back. Patrols vanished. Garrisons were bled thin by raids that struck from nowhere and melted into the sand. And when the counting was done, world by world and year by year, the losses were far greater than anyone had expected against a people the Imperium dismissed as scattered savages. Here was a crack the Emperor could not yet name. The official reckonings spoke of the Fremen as a small and backward folk, few in number, hardly worth the counting. But the numbers told a quieter and more unsettling story. To keep the peace on Arrakis, the Harkonnens lost soldiers at a rate that would have alarmed anyone who studied it closely. And most did not study it closely, because it did not fit the legend they carried in their minds. The universe knew that the Sardaukar were the finest soldiers alive, and that everyone else fell somewhere far beneath them. There was no room, in that neat and comfortable picture, for a people of the sand who fought the Imperium's soldiers and came away the winners more often than they should. And there was a third crack, subtler still, and it went to the very root of what made the Sardaukar what they were. The whole legend rested on the idea that Salusa Secundus, the death planet, produced the hardest soldiers in the universe because it was the harshest place a human being could be forged. But this was only true if Salusa Secundus was in fact the harshest place. And it was not. There existed, in the Imperium, a world harsher still. A world so cruel that the Emperor's own prison planet was gentle by comparison. That world was Arrakis, where Salusa Secundus killed the weak among prisoners who were fed and housed by their jailers. Arrakis killed the weak among a whole people who had no jailers, no supply, no mercy, and no rest. Only an endless desert that punished every mistake with death. If a prison planet could forge the Sardaukar, then what might a world even more merciless forge among those who called it home and had survived it not for years, but for uncounted generations? This was the question the Emperor had never thought to ask, because the legend had never required him to ask it. The Sardaukar were the finest, because everyone said so, and everyone said so because the Sardaukar were the finest. And in that closed and comfortable circle, the throne had rested for 10,000 years. It had never occurred to Shaddam IV that somewhere in his own empire there might be soldiers who were not made by his design, not sworn to his throne, not counted in his legions, and yet harder than anything he possessed. Such a thought would have been almost unthinkable, for it would have meant that the foundation of imperial power was not a wall, but a wager, and that the wager might be lost. So the cracks were there, faint and unheeded, running through the legend like the thin fractures that run through old stone long before it gives way. The Sardaukar were fewer than they seemed, softer than they had been, and no longer forged by the harshest world after all. And upon that harsher world, a people waited, unnumbered and underestimated, growing stronger with every patrol they destroyed, every soldier they took, every year the Imperium looked away. The Emperor's confidence in his terrible soldiers was about to be carried to Arrakis and set down upon the sand, and the sand would test it as it had never been tested before. And when a thing that has never been tested is tested at last, it learns very quickly whether it was truly strong or only fortunate. And the Sardaukar had been fortunate for a very long time. But to understand how such a testing could even be possible, we must turn now from the throne and its fading forge and go out at last into the deep desert itself to meet the people the whole Imperium had overlooked. Up next in Chapter 8, the people of the deep desert will journey into the hidden sea edges of Arrakis and meet the Fremen, survivors of the harshest world imaginable, and begin to understand who they truly were. And so at last we leave the throne behind, and the gray soldiers, and the great houses with their quarrels, and we go out into the desert. We go softly, the way one crosses a threshold into a quieter room, and we come to the people the whole Imperium had overlooked. They were called the Fremen, and they were the native people of the deep desert of Arrakis, and tonight we will simply come to know them, gently, without haste, the way you might come to know a place by walking through it slowly at the close of a long day. Arrakis was a world of sand. To those who ruled it from afar, it was valuable for one reason only: the spice melange, which was found nowhere else in all the universe, and which made the Harkonnens rich and the guild able to fold space, and the whole Imperium able to function. But for the people who lived upon it, Arrakis was not a source of wealth. It was home, and it was the cruelest home imaginable. Across most of its surface there fell no rain. There were no rivers, no lakes, no open water of any kind. There were only the endless dunes, the burning days and the freezing nights, the great storms that could strip the flesh from bone, and the deep desert where the giant sandworms ruled, and where no stranger could walk and live. The powers of the Imperium believed that almost no one lived in that deep desert. They believed the Fremen were a scattered handful of primitives, ragged folk clinging to the edges of the polar regions, few in number, of no account, hardly worth the trouble of counting. This belief was convenient, and it was wrong, and its wrongness was one of the great secrets of Arrakis. For the Fremen were not few. They were many, far more numerous than any census admitted, and they did not cling to the edges. They lived in the very heart of the desert that everyone else believed uninhabitable, and they had made of that impossible place a home. They lived in hidden strongholds carved into the rock, and these they called sietches. A sietch was a community sealed away from the killing air of the surface. a warren of chambers and passages hollowed into cave and cliff, where whole communities of Fremen lived out their lives unseen. There they kept their families, their stores, their gardens grown in secret against the dream of a greener world. And there, most precious of all, they kept their water. For water on Arrakis was not a thing taken for granted, as it is in gentler places. Water was life itself, counted drop by drop, more precious than any coin, and the Sietches held it hidden away in great secret reservoirs, guarded and hoarded across generations. To the Fremen, the wealth of a Sietch was measured not in spice or coin, but in the water it held. Above all, the Fremen were hidden. This was perhaps the strangest thing about them, and the reason the Imperium so badly misjudged them. A people so numerous, spread across so wide a world, and yet the powers that ruled Arrakis had no true idea how many they were or where their strongholds lay. The Fremen had made themselves invisible. They moved by night and by stealth. They crossed the open sand in ways that left no trace and drew no worm. They hid their Sietches so well that the Harkonnens, who had ruled Arrakis for 80 years, had never found and never destroyed them. And when the counting of the desert people was done, the rulers of Arrakis wrote down small and comfortable numbers and slept easily, and never guessed how badly they had deceived themselves. Consider what such hiding required. To conceal not one person, but a whole people, generation after generation, upon a world that others watched from orbit and patrolled by air, demanded a discipline and a unity almost beyond imagining. Every Fremen, from the eldest to the smallest child, understood that the survival of all depended on the silence of each. Their Sietches were secrets kept by thousands, and the secrets held. This alone should have told the Imperium something, for a scattered and broken people cannot keep such secrets. Only a people bound together by iron discipline and shared purpose can vanish so completely and stay vanished for so long. And yet, though they hid, they did not hide out of weakness. They hid because they were patient, and because they were waiting. The Fremen did not fear the desert. They had made the desert their ally and their fortress, and any enemy who came seeking them had to enter a world that fought on the Fremen's side. The heat, the thirst, the storms, the worms, all of these were friends to the desert people and death to the stranger. So the Fremen could afford to wait, hidden and quiet, letting the harshness of their own world do much of their fighting for them, striking only when they chose and vanishing before any answer could come. They dressed for their world in a way no outsider could match. Over their bodies they wore the stillsuit, a marvel of desert craft, a garment that enclosed the whole body and reclaimed its moisture, capturing the water of breath and sweat and even waste, filtering it and returning it clean, so that a Fremen could cross the open desert for days and lose almost nothing of the water within them. To the Fremen this was not a curiosity, but the difference between life and death, and they wore their stillsuits with the ease of long habit, adjusting them by instinct, tending them with a care that outsiders never understood. A person clothed so, at home in that killing land, needed no walls and no supply lines. They carried their survival upon their own bodies. Every power in the Imperium underestimated them, and this was the deepest truth of the Fremen, the truth from which everything else would follow. The Emperor upon his throne did not think of them at all. The great houses had never heard their name. The Harkonnens who ruled over them saw them only as vermin to be hunted for sport, a nuisance in the deep desert, a source of the strange and unexplained losses that we spoke of before, but that no one troubled to understand. Even the Spacing Guild, which knew almost everything, kept its knowledge of the deep desert carefully quiet for reasons of its own. And so, the Fremen lived at the very center of the most valuable world in the universe, watched by everyone and truly seen by no one, dismissed by every power that mattered. But those who are overlooked are also those who are free to grow strong unwatched. While the Imperium spent its attention on the quarrels of great houses and the counting of spice, the desert people went on being forged, quietly, by the hardest teacher there is. Every day upon Arrakis asked of them a discipline that no drilled army could match. And every day they answered it, and survived, and grew harder still. They were not made in a prison by the cruelty of jailers. They were made by their own world, freely and completely, until survival itself had become their art and their faith. And a people so made, hidden and patient and utterly at home in the harshest place in the universe, was something the Imperium had no name for and no defense against. The Emperor believed his terrible soldiers were the finest in the universe. He had never met the Fremen, and he had never walked their sand, and he did not know that a whole people had been quietly forged into something his legions could not answer. But the two were being drawn, slowly and surely, toward the same patch of sand, and when at last they met, the whole comfortable order of the stars would learn what the desert had been making all along, out of sight, in the deep places no one had thought to look. Up next in Chapter 9, How the Fremen Are Forged, we'll follow how a lifetime in that merciless desert shaped every Fremen into a warrior by necessity, and made of an entire people something no drilled army could ever be. Far from the gray barracks of Salusa Secundus, far from the Emperor's prison world and its lessons in cruelty, another people were being shaped into warriors, though no throne had planned it and no ruler had willed it. On the desert planet of Arrakis, the world men called Dune, the Fremen were forged not by a design of power, but by the plain and patient teaching of the sand itself. There was no academy here, no order handed down from above, no fortress where the strong were set upon the weak for a distant lord's amusement. There was only the desert, burning by day and bitterly cold by night, and the simple truth that ran beneath every hour of a Fremen life. On this world, a single mistake could cost you everything, and the desert kept no record of your intentions, only of your errors. Consider what it meant to be born among the Fremen, in the sheltered warrens they called sieches, hidden within the rock of the desert. A child of the sietch did not enter a soft world. From the earliest days of memory, that child learned that water was life, that the open sand was death, and that the small, careless act might be the last act of all. There was no long season of innocence in which the hard truths were kept at a distance. The truths were simply there, woven into the walls of the caves, felt in the dryness of the air and the weight of every drop of moisture. A Fremen child grew up understanding, without ever being lectured, that survival was not owed to anyone, that it had to be earned again with each passing day. This was the great difference between the Fremen and the Sardaukar, and it is worth resting on gently, the way one rests on a single warm thought before sleep. The Sardaukar were made by an empire that chose cruelty as a tool, that gathered the desperate and the condemned and set them against a punishing planet to harvest the survivors as soldiers. The suffering of Salusa Secundus was designed, an instrument in the hands of the emperor. But the desert of Arrakis had no such purpose. It was simply itself, ancient and indifferent, and the Fremen who lived upon it became warriors, because nothing softer could have endured there at all. Their hardness was not the product of a plan. It was the natural shape a people took when their home demanded everything of them and forgave nothing. Every mistake on Arrakis was answered by death, and this stern arithmetic worked upon the Fremen from the moment they could walk. A child who wandered too far from shelter, who failed to read the signs of a coming storm, might not return. A hunter who moved carelessly on the open sand, who let a rhythmic footfall carry into the deep, might summon one of the great worms and vanish beneath the dunes. There was no margin here for the lazy or the distracted. And so the Fremen grew watchful in a way that no drill could ever teach. Watchful the way an animal is watchful, alert to the smallest change in the wind and the light and the color of the sky. Their senses were sharpened not by an instructor, but by the plain necessity of staying alive. In such a world, the difference between a warrior and an ordinary person quietly dissolved. Among the great houses of the Imperium, and even in the ranks of the Emperor, there were soldiers and there were civilians, and the line between them was clear. A farmer was not a fighter, a merchant was not a swordsman, and armies were drawn from special men set apart for the trade of war. But among the Fremen, there was no such division, because the desert made no such division. Every man who could walk the sand was a warrior, and so was every woman, and even the children carried the hardness of the place in their small bodies. To live on Arrakis at all was already to have passed a test that would have killed most of the pampered soldiers of the Imperium in a matter of days. The Fremen did not train for war as a separate task. They simply lived, and living had made them dangerous. There is a stillness in this idea that suits the late hour. Picture the Sietch at rest, the people gathered in their warm and shadowed chambers while the desert howls far above. These were not brutalized prisoners driven to fury by their keepers. They were a whole people, with families and songs and ancient memories, with the long, slow customs of a community that had endured for uncounted generations. Their strength did not come from hatred or from fear of a master. It came from belonging to one another and to the desert that had shaped them. When a Fremen fought, that Fremen fought as a member of a people, defending a way of life carved patiently out of the harshest world imaginable. And the desert, for all its cruelty, gave as well as it took. It gave the Fremen a body suited to the dryness, lungs and skin and habits tuned to conserve every trace of moisture. It gave them an eyesight that could read the dunes like a familiar face and a sense of direction that needed no instrument beneath the open stars. It gave them patience, the deep patience of people who measured time not in the hurried spans of the courts, but in the slow turning of the seasons and the long work of shaping a planet across centuries. Every hardship was also a teacher, and the Fremen were the most attentive students any world has ever raised, because the price of inattention was so absolute. Think, too, of the long memory that ran through such a people. The Fremen were not new to Arrakis. Their ancestors had wandered from world to world across the ages before finding this last and hardest home, and the desert had been shaping them for so many generations that its lessons had settled into the very habits of the tribe. A Fremen child did not learn survival from a single teacher in a single season. That child inherited it the way one inherits a language from everyone around them. This was a depth of preparation no army could ever drill into its soldiers, for it was the work not of years but of ages. And because this hardness came from their home and not from a master, it carried no resentment within it. One cannot resent the desert any more than one can resent the sky. The Fremen loved their harsh world even as it tested them, and this quiet love gave their strength a wholeness the Emperor's troops could never know. The powers of the Imperium looked at Arrakis and saw only a wasteland, a source of the precious spice and nothing more. They saw the Fremen, when they noticed them at all, as scattered bands of desert wanderers, poor and primitive, hardly worth the counting. This blindness would cost them dearly in the end. For while the great houses drilled their soldiers in comfortable garrisons, and while the emperor took quiet pride in his troops from the prison world, the desert of Arrakis was patiently forging a people harder than any of them, tempered not by design, but by the oldest and most honest teacher of all. The Fremen did not know they were becoming the finest soldiers in the universe. They only knew how to live where nothing else could, and that knowledge, in time, would prove to be the same thing. So the forging of the Fremen was a slow and silent process, without ceremony, without cruelty imposed from above, without any lord to claim the credit. It was the work of the sand and the sun and the cold desert night, working upon a people generation after generation, keeping only those who could learn and shedding those who could not, until an entire nation had been shaped into something the Imperium could not imagine and would not believe until it stood upon them. Rest now on that image of a people made strong not by hatred but by their home. And let the quiet of the Sayach settle over you. Up next in Chapter 10, The Discipline of Water, we'll explore how the Fremen's absolute reverence for water, their remarkable stillsuits, and their unbending code created a people of extraordinary self-control, endurance, and unity, a discipline deeper and older than anything a drilled army could ever hope to match. If any single thing lay at the heart of the Fremen, quieter and deeper than their weapons or their warriors, it was their reverence for water. On Arrakis, where the open desert held almost no moisture at all, water was not merely useful. It was the measure of life itself, the most precious substance in the world, more valued than the spice that the Imperium coveted, more valued than gold or jewels or any treasure the great houses hoarded in their vaults. And out of this simple, absolute fact grew a discipline so complete that it shaped every hour of a Fremen life and made of an entire people a study in self-control that no army of the Imperium could ever approach. To understand the Fremen, one must first understand what water meant to them. In the sietches hidden within the rock, the Fremen gathered and guarded the moisture of their people with a devotion that ran deeper than any law. Every drop was accounted for. The very air they breathed within their shelters was reclaimed, the moisture caught and returned to the common store. When a Fremen wept, which was rare, the giving of tears was regarded as a gift of great meaning, for it meant giving water to the dead, the highest honor a body could offer. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was taken for granted. In such a world, waste was not merely foolish. It was a kind of sin, a betrayal of the whole community that depended on every measure being kept. At the center of this discipline stood one of the great marvels of Fremen life, the stillsuit. Picture this remarkable garment, worn against the skin across the whole of the body, a second skin fitted with such care that it captured nearly everything the body gave off. The moisture of breath and sweat, which on any other world would simply be lost to the air, was caught within the layers of the suit, filtered and returned to the wearer to be drunk again through a small tube near the mouth. A properly fitted stillsuit lost only a thimbleful of moisture in a day. With such a garment, a Fremen could cross the open desert for weeks, carrying their own small world of water upon their body, self-contained and enduring, where any outsider would have perished within hours. The stillsuit was more than a tool. It was the physical form of the Fremen relationship with water, a daily discipline worn against the skin, a constant reminder that survival depended upon losing nothing. And here is the gentle truth that separated the Fremen from every drilled soldier of the Imperium. The discipline of the stillsuit could not be worn correctly by accident. It demanded attention every moment, 100 small adjustments and habits that had to become second nature. A seal left loose, a tube fitted carelessly, a filter neglected, and the desert would exact its price. To live in a stillsuit was to practice without pause. A discipline of the body so constant that it sank below thought and became simply the way one existed. The Fremen did not need to be ordered to maintain their equipment, the way the soldiers of the great houses were drilled and inspected. Their discipline came from within, planted so deep by the necessity of their world that it needed no overseer at all. This inner discipline extended far beyond water alone, though water was its root. The Fremen lived by a harsh code, a body of customs and laws that governed their conduct with the same unbending rigor the desert demanded. Their society had no room for the soft self-indulgence of the courts, no place for the vanity and excess that filled the palaces of the Landsraad. Everything among the Fremen was weighed against the survival of the whole, and the individual who threatened that survival through carelessness or selfishness could not be tolerated. Yet this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the natural order of a people who understood in their bones that they lived or died together, and that the failing of one could mean the ending of many. Even the counting of their wealth was measured in water. Among the Fremen, a person's riches were reckoned not in coin or in land, but in the water they held, kept safe in the great hidden stores of the Sietch. There were vast reservoirs sealed away in the rock, guarded across the generations, water gathered drop by patient, drop toward a dream few outsiders ever suspected. For the Fremen nursed a secret hope, a plan stretching across centuries to change the very face of Arrakis, to green the desert little by little until one distant day their harsh world might bloom. And so their discipline of water was not only a matter of survival, but a matter of faith. Each drop withheld a small offering toward a future none of them would live to see. They went without today so that their distant children might one day walk beneath open water and living green. And a people who can deny themselves for a future so far off carry a discipline that no ordinary want can shake. Out of this shared discipline grew a unity that the Imperium could scarcely comprehend. The armies of the Emperor were bound together by fear and by loyalty to a distant throne. The soldiers of the great houses fought for pay, or for duty, or for the honor of their lords. But the Fremen were bound to one another by something far older and far stronger, by the simple fact that each depended upon all, and all upon each. In the Sietch, the water of a person who died was returned to the tribe, so that even in death, a Fremen gave to the community that had given them life. This was not a matter of policy, but of feeling, a bond that held a whole people together as if they were a single body moving across the sand. Consider the extraordinary self-control this way of living produced. A people who could measure out every breath, who could cross a burning desert without complaint, who could go without and endure and wait, who could hold their patience through hardships that would break the will of ordinary men. Such a people carried within them a strength that had nothing to do with muscle or weapons. It was the strength of a will trained by necessity until it was almost unbreakable. The pampered soldier of the Imperium, however skilled with a blade, had never known such want, had never been asked to master himself so completely. When the day of testing came, this hidden discipline of the Fremen would prove to matter far more than any advantage of numbers or arms. There is a deep calm in this discipline, a calm that suits the quiet of the late hour. The Fremen were not a frantic people, not driven by rage or by the sharp anxieties of those who fear to lose their comforts. They had already made their peace with hardship, already given up the soft things that others clung to, and in that giving up, they had found a kind of freedom. A person who has mastered their own body and their own wants stands upon ground that no enemy can take away. The Fremen moved through their harsh world with a steadiness that came from within. A serenity born not of ease, but of endurance, and it made them formidable in a way that had nothing to do with the fury of battle. So the discipline of water was, in truth, the discipline of the whole Fremen spirit. It began with the guarding of every drop, with the still suit worn against the skin, with the reclaiming of moisture from the very air, and it grew into a code that governed all of life, and from that code came a unity and a self-mastery that no drilled army could match. While the Sardaukar were hardened by cruelty imposed from without, the Fremen were disciplined by a reverence that rose from within, and this quiet strength, patient and unshakable, was the deep foundation upon which all their warrior skill would rest. Let that stillness settle over you now, the calm of a people who had learned to want little and to lose nothing. Up next in Chapter 11, Fighting on the Sand, we'll explore how the Fremen turned their mastery of the desert into war, their crysknives and their patience, their gift for appearing and vanishing among the dunes, and their utter fearlessness in the face of death. When the Fremen went to war, they did not fight the way the armies of the Imperium fought. They did not gather in ordered ranks upon open ground, did not march in gleaming formations to meet an enemy face to face in the manner the great houses prized. The Fremen fought the way the desert had taught them to live, with patience and stealth, and a mastery of their world so complete that the sand itself seemed to fight on their side. To face the Fremen on Arrakis was to face not only warriors, but the whole of the desert, and few who tried it understood, until too late, how utterly the ground had turned against them. The first weapon of the Fremen was the desert itself, and their knowledge of it was beyond anything an outsider could learn. They knew the dunes as a person knows the rooms of a childhood home, knew where the sand lay firm, and where it would swallow a careless foot, knew the hidden ways between the rocks where a band of fighters might wait unseen. They could read the wind and the weather, could sense the coming of the great storms that scoured the open sand, and they knew how to use those storms as cover, moving through the chaos that would blind any other force. Where the soldiers of the Imperium saw only a featureless waste, the Fremen saw a landscape rich with meaning, full of paths and hiding places and quiet advantages, all theirs. And so the Fremen could appear and vanish like a trick of the heat shimmer. A patrol of Imperial troops might cross the desert, believing themselves alone, and in an instant find themselves surrounded by fighters who seemed to rise out of the sand. Then, as quickly as they had come, the Fremen would be gone again, melting back into the dunes, leaving no trail an outsider could follow. This was not sorcery, though it must have seemed so to those who suffered it. It was the fruit of a lifetime spent learning the desert, of bodies trained to move silently, of a people who used every fold of the land to conceal themselves. They struck when they chose and withdrew before an answer could be made, and their enemies, for all their weapons and their numbers, could never quite lay hold of them. At the heart of Fremen war stood the crysknife, the sacred blade of their people, made from the tooth of one of the great sandworms of Arrakis. This was no ordinary weapon. The crysknife was a thing of deep meaning to the Fremen, drawn only when it would taste blood, bound by custom and by a reverence that ran to the roots of their culture. Milky white and curved, taken from the very creatures that ruled the deep desert, the crysknife carried within it the spirit of Arrakis itself. To wield one was to carry a piece of the desert's power in the hand, and the Fremen wielded it with a skill honed by their harsh way of living, a skill in close and personal combat that the pampered swordsmen of the Imperium could not match. For the Fremen had learned to fight as they had learned to survive, without margin and without hesitation. The Imperium in these ages had learned to fight in a particular way, shaped by the shields that protected the highborn and their soldiers. the personal force fields that turned aside any blow struck with speed. Against a shield, a fast thrust was useless, and warriors had learned instead the slow blade, the patient stroke that could slip through the shimmering barrier where a quick one could not. This was a discipline of measured slowness, of feints and careful timing. Yet upon the open desert of Arrakis, shields could not be freely used, for the field of a shield drove the great worms into a killing frenzy and drew them from far across the sand. And so on Dune the Fremen fought largely without shields, in a raw and more honest way, and their skill in this unshielded combat, blade against blade and body against body, was terrible to behold. They had never grown soft behind the false safety of a force field. They fought with the whole of themselves. Beneath all the skill and all the stealth lay something that unsettled their enemies most of all, and that was the Fremen attitude toward death. The soldiers of the great houses feared death, as most men do, and even the fanatics of the emperor, for all their savagery, fought to live and to conquer. But the Fremen had made their peace with dying in a way few peoples ever have. Their harsh faith and their harsh world had taught them to regard death without the trembling that gripped softer men. They did not throw their lives away carelessly, for every Fremen life was precious to the tribe, and their water was owed to their people. Yet when the moment came, a Fremen could face the ending of their life with a steadiness that struck terror into those who faced them. An enemy who does not fear to die is an enemy against whom the usual threats mean nothing, and the Fremen carried this fearlessness as naturally as they carried their blades. There was, as well, a quiet economy in the way the Fremen made war, a refusal to waste anything, carried over from their reverence for water into the very manner of their fighting. They did not spend lives freely, did not throw fighters against an enemy in the reckless way of commanders who counted their soldiers as numbers. Every Fremen was precious, bound to the tribe by blood and by water, and so they never overreached, never spent themselves in a single foolish stroke. They took what the moment offered and waited for the next opening, wearing an enemy down across many small encounters until the balance had shifted beyond repair. An army that will not waste itself is far harder to defeat than one that hurls everything into a single charge. Consider, too, the patience that ran through all their fighting. The Fremen were never in a hurry. They had learned from the desert that haste was the mother of error, and that the patient hunter outlasted the eager one. They could wait, silent and unmoving, for as long as the desert demanded, until the moment was exactly right. They could travel great distances across the open sand to strike at a time and place of their own choosing. This patience, joined to their stealth and their fearlessness, made them a foe unlike any the Imperium had known. One could not draw them into a rash attack. They chose their battles, and they chose them well, and they did not fight until the balance was already tilted in their favor. There is something almost peaceful in the Fremen way of war, strange as that may sound, and it suits the gentle hour of rest. They did not fight out of hatred or a lust for glory. They fought as the desert lived, quietly, patiently, with an economy of motion and a deep calm at the center of it all. There was no wasted fury in them, only the steady and unhurried application of a lifetime of hard-won skill. Even in battle, the Fremen carried the stillness of the siege and the discipline of the water, and this stillness made them all the more formidable, for it meant they never lost themselves, never gave way to the panic and confusion that undid other armies. They fought with clear eyes and steady hands, at home in the harsh world that terrified their foes. So the Fremen turned their mastery of the desert into a way of war that no other force could answer. They made the sand their weapon and their shield, struck from hiding and vanished again, wielded their sacred blades with terrible skill, and faced death with a calm that broke the courage of stronger armies. All of this had grown from the same root, from a life lived at the mercy of Arrakis, until fighting and surviving had become, for the Fremen, very nearly the same thing. Let that quiet mastery settle over you now, the picture of warriors as patient and unhurried as the dunes themselves. Up next in Chapter 12, The Sandworms as Allies, we'll explore how the Fremen alone learned to summon and to ride the great worms of Arrakis, turning the most dangerous creatures in the universe into mounts and weapons that no other army in all the Imperium could hope to match. Of all the wonders of the Fremen, and all the reasons they stood above every other fighting force in the Imperium, none was stranger than this. Alone among all the peoples of the known universe, the Fremen had learned to summon and to ride the great sandworms of Arrakis, the vast and terrible creatures of the deep desert, and to make of the most dangerous beings in creation their allies in war. To grasp what this meant, one must first understand what the sandworms were, and why every other power in the Imperium regarded them only with dread. The sandworms of Arrakis were beyond anything imagined on other worlds. They were creatures of the deep desert, the greatest of them stretching hundreds of meters in length, moving beneath the sand like living leviathans. Their great round mouths, ringed with crystal teeth, could swallow a machine whole, and their coming was announced by a swelling ripple in the dunes and a distant hissing rush that meant death drew near. They were drawn by rhythm, by any steady vibration upon the open sand, and a careless footfall or the drumming of a machine could call one from far away to devour whatever had disturbed the desert. For the outsiders who came to Arrakis for the spice, the worms were simply the terror of the deep, a hazard to be avoided at all cost. No one who was not Fremen imagined that such creatures could be anything but a menace. Yet the Fremen, who had lived upon the desert for uncounted generations, had come to know the worms as no outsider ever could. They understood the ways of the great creatures, understood how they moved and how they were drawn, and how they might be handled by those with the courage and the knowledge to try. And out of this deep understanding grew the most extraordinary skill of all, the calling and the riding of the worms, a practice so bold and so demanding that it stood at the very center of what it meant to be a full member of the Fremen people. To ride a worm was the great passage of Fremen life, the proof of one's mastery of the desert, a feat that bound the rider forever to the harsh world that had raised them. The calling of a worm began with a tool the Fremen had made for exactly this purpose, the thumper, a device set upon the sand that beat out a steady, rhythmic pounding. This regular drumming spread through the desert and drew a worm toward it, summoning the very creature that others spent their lives fleeing. And while the worm rushed toward the sound, the Fremen rider would wait, poised and ready, with a set of tools they called the maker hooks, long instruments used to catch and hold the leading edge of one of the worm's great ring segments. As the enormous creature passed, the rider would run alongside upon the sand, plant the hooks, and pull open a segment of the worm's hide. The worm, unwilling to bring the sensitive, opened flesh down into the abrasive sand, would roll that part of itself upward, lifting it clear, and in doing so would turn and rise so that the rider could mount its vast back. Once astride the worm, the Fremen rider guided the creature by holding the segment open, steering the great beast across the desert by controlling which part of its body it kept from the sand. In this way, a single Fremen could ride one of the largest and most feared creatures in all the universe as if it were a mount, traveling swiftly across the open desert that would have taken days to cross on foot. Whole bands of Fremen could summon and ride the worms together, moving across the sand upon a herd of living giants, covering vast distances at speed and appearing where no enemy would ever think to look for them. What had been the terror of Arrakis became, in Fremen hands, the swiftest road across it. Consider now what this meant for war. The armies of the Imperium, for all their weapons and their discipline, had no answer to the worms. The great creatures could not be tamed by outsiders, could not be fought with any weapon the Imperium possessed, could not even be safely approached. To the soldiers of the Emperor and the great houses, the deep desert was simply forbidden ground, a place of certain death where no ordered army could go. But to the Fremen, it was home, and the worms that ruled it were theirs to command. This gave the Fremen a freedom of movement and a reach that no other force could match. They could cross the desert that stopped everyone else, carry their fighters swiftly to any point upon the sand, and strike from directions their enemies believed to be impassable. And the worms were more than mounts. In the great battles to come, the Fremen would ride them directly into the ranks of their enemies, turning the leviathans of the desert into living engines of war. Picture the sight of it, the ground itself heaving and splitting as the enormous worms rose beneath an army that had thought itself safe upon the open sand, the great mouths and the crystal teeth. The panic of soldiers who had no defense against such a thing. No wall, no formation, no weapon of the Imperium had been made to stand against the worms of Arrakis, for no one had imagined that any people could turn them into instruments of battle. The Fremen alone had done the impossible, and it gave them a weapon beyond the reckoning of every power that opposed them. Think also of what the riding of the worms did to the spirit of a people. To run alongside one of the great creatures as it rushed toward the thumper, to plant the hooks and open a segment of that vast and living hide, to mount the back of a beast that could swallow a machine whole, all of this demanded a courage few outside Arrakis could imagine. And every full Fremen had done it. The passage from child to adult among the desert people was bound up with this very feat, so that no one walked as a grown member of the tribe who had not faced the worm and mastered their own fear upon its back. Such a people did not need to be taught bravery. They had earned it upon the sand, each of them, as the plain price of growing up. And out of that shared ordeal grew a deep and quiet trust that ran through the whole of the tribe. There was a deeper meaning in the Fremen bond with the worms, one that went beyond the uses of war. The worms were tied to the spice itself, woven into the great cycle of life upon Arrakis, and the Fremen held them in a reverence close to worship. The crysknives they carried were made from the teeth of the worms. Their deepest beliefs and their oldest hopes were bound up with the great creatures of the sand. To ride a worm was not only a feat of skill, but an act of communion with the very spirit of their world. The Fremen did not conquer the worms through force, for no force could master such beings. They had instead made themselves so fully a part of the desert that even its most terrible creatures became, in a sense, their partners. This was the ultimate expression of what set the Fremen apart, a people so at home in their harsh world that its greatest dangers had become their greatest strengths. And so the same desert that had forged the Fremen, that had disciplined them through the reverence for water, that had taught them to fight with patience and stealth, gave them at the last this crowning gift, the mastery of the worms. Where every other power in the Imperium saw only monsters to be feared, the Fremen saw allies to be ridden, and in that difference lay the measure of how far they surpassed all others. Rest now upon that quiet marvel, the image of a people riding the great creatures of the deep across a moonlit desert, at peace with the terrors that ruled their world. Up next in Chapter 13, Paul Among the Fremen, will explore how the exiled heir of House Atreides, taken in by the desert people, came to recognize the hidden power sleeping in the sand, and how he rose among them to become their leader, the one they would call Muad'Dib. When the night fell over the great desert and the last light drained from the western dunes, a young man walked among a people who were not his own. His name was Paul Atreides, the son of a murdered duke, the heir of a house that had been broken in a single terrible night on Arrakis. Once he had been the boy of Caladan, a green world of oceans where rain fell soft upon old stone and the sea murmured against the cliffs below his father's castle. Now he walked upon sand that had never known rain, beneath stars so bright and so many that they seemed to press down upon the land, and the people around him were the Fremen, the hidden folk of the deep desert whom the whole Imperium had chosen to overlook. He had come to them as a fugitive, with only his mother beside him. The betrayal of House Atreides had cast them into the open sand with nothing but their wits and the training they carried within their own bodies. Any ordinary refugee would have died in that wilderness within a day, parched and lost, food for the worms. But Paul was not ordinary, and neither was the Lady Jessica, his mother, who had been trained in the deep disciplines of the Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood of the mind. They had survived the desert long enough to be found, and being found by the Fremen was itself a kind of test. For the desert people did not trust outsiders and did not easily forgive weakness. Yet Paul had seen something in them from the first moment, something no lord of the Landsraad had ever troubled to notice. Where the great powers of the universe saw only ragged tribesmen scraping a life from a useless waste, Paul saw warriors. He saw the way they moved across the sand without sound, the way they wasted nothing, not a word, not a gesture, not a single drop of moisture. He saw the calm in their eyes, stained the deepest blue by the spice that saturated their world. He saw a people who had been shaped by hardship into something harder and finer than any army the emperor had ever assembled, and he understood, quietly and completely, that hidden in the sand was a fighting force the like of which the Imperium had never faced. The Fremen, for their part, were slow to accept him, and rightly so, for they had learned across long centuries that the great houses brought only exploitation and death. But there were old prophecies among them, seeds planted long ago by the wandering sisters of the Bene Gesserit, telling of a mother and a son who would come to lead the desert people to their freedom and to a green paradise. When they saw the way Paul carried himself, when they saw that he could fight and that he did not flinch from their harsh ways, some among them began to wonder whether the old words had at last come true. His acceptance was not given freely. It was earned in the way of the desert, through struggle and through blood. There was a man named James who challenged Paul, and by the ancient law of the tribe the two of them met in single combat, blade against blade, in the ritual that decided such things. Paul had never before killed a man, and when it was over and James lay still upon the cavern floor, he wept, for he had been raised to value life and to understand the weight of taking it. The Fremen watched him weep and did not understand it at first, for water was so precious to them that they could scarcely grasp a man who would give his own tears to the dead. Yet in that strange grief they came to see that here was one who did not kill lightly, and that was a thing they could respect. From that night he was one of them, and they gave him a place in the tribe and names of his own choosing. He took the name Usul for his secret name within the Sietch, a word that meant the strength at the base of the pillar, the deep foundation that held everything above it. And for his public name, the name that would be cried across the open sand, he chose Muad'Dib, after the small desert mouse that the Fremen admired, the little creature that survived where nothing else could, that knew the secrets of the night and the ways of the deep desert. The Fremen saw in that small mouse a teacher of survival, and to take its name was to take upon oneself the promise of endurance. It was a humble name and a cunning one, and it would grow into a name that shook the thrones of the universe. There was tenderness in this taking of names, for the Fremen did not give such things lightly. To be named within the tribe was to be woven into it, to belong to the shared water and the shared secrets. Paul, who had lost his father and his home and every certainty of his childhood, found in this belonging a shelter he had not expected, and he began to feel the desert become, in some slow way, a home. In the Sietches, in the hidden caverns beneath the rock where the Fremen lived their sheltered lives away from the killing sun, Paul learned their ways from the inside. He learned to wear the stillsuit that reclaimed the body's every drop of moisture, so that a man might walk for days across the sand and lose almost nothing to the burning air. He learned the discipline of water, the sacred arithmetic by which the tribe measured its wealth not in coin, but in the moisture it could hoard against the dry death of the desert. He learned to walk without rhythm across the open dunes, the broken irregular stride that would not draw the attention of the great worms below. He learned the crysknife, the sacred blade ground from the tooth of a slain worm, milky and curved, and never to be sheathed again without tasting blood. He learned their patience, which was deeper than any patience he had ever known. And as he learned, he began to teach in return. For Paul carried within him the fighting arts of House Atreides, the disciplines of the great swordmasters and warriors who had served his father, and he carried too the strange trained awareness of the Bene Gesserit, passed to him by his mother. He began to share these gifts with the young men and women of the tribe, and they took to them swiftly, for their bodies were already tempered and their spirits already fierce. What might have taken an ordinary soldier years to master, the Fremen absorbed in weeks, because the desert had already given them everything except the final polish, and that polish was what Paul had come to bring. Slowly, across the long desert seasons, a change moved through the scattered tribes. Word passed from sietch to sietch, carried by runners across the night, of the young offworlder who fought like a demon of the deep sand and who spoke of freedom, of a day when the spice would belong to those who bled for it, when the sky itself would answer to the desert. The Fremen had always been many small and separate peoples, each tribe guarding its own hidden home, each suspicious of the others. But in Muad'Dib they began to find a single purpose, a thread that ran through all the sietches and drew them quietly together, tribe by tribe, until the desert that the Imperium believed empty was in truth alive with a gathering strength. The Emperor upon his golden throne knew nothing of this. The Harkonnens, who had seized the planet, knew nothing of it. They counted the Fremen as vermin, as a nuisance to be culled, and they had no notion that in the deep desert an exiled prince was recognizing and gathering and beginning to shape the finest fighting people that had ever drawn breath. The sand kept its secret, as the sand keeps all things, and the young man who had come with nothing walked now at the heart of a hidden nation that did not yet know its own power. Up next in Chapter 14, the training of Muad'Dib's legions, will follow how Paul and the Fremen sharpened their already formidable skills into a disciplined army, uniting the scattered tribes of the deep desert into a force at last capable of challenging the Emperor himself. In the long, quiet seasons that followed his acceptance among the desert people, Paul Atreides, who was now called Muad'Dib, set himself to a patient and enormous work. He had recognized the hidden strength of the Fremen, the raw and terrible skill that the desert had ground into them across 10,000 years. Now, he meant to gather that strength, to shape it, to give it a single edge and a single purpose, and to forge from the scattered tribes of Arrakis an army such as the Imperium, in all its long history, had never been made to face. It was not a work of harshness. And this was the great difference between what Paul built and what the Emperor had built upon the prison world of Salusa Secundus. The Sardaukar had been made through cruelty, through through a training ground that killed the weak and hardened the survivors into fanatics, ruled by fear and by the distant glory of a throne they would never truly share. But the Fremen came to Muad'Dib already whole, already tempered, already fierce beyond any drilled soldier, and what he gave them was not cruelty, but focus. He gathered a hardness that already existed and turned it toward a purpose that they chose for themselves, which was the freedom of their world. He taught them the fighting arts he had carried out of the ruin of his house. The warriors of House Atreides had been among the finest in the known universe, trained by masters whose skill with the blade was the stuff of legend, and Paul had learned at their hands from the time he could walk. He had learned, too, the strange body disciplines of the Bene Gesserit, the sisterhood of his mother, the control of muscle and nerve and breath that let a trained fighter move faster than the eye could follow and read the intention of an enemy before the blow was struck. All of this he opened to the Fremen, and they received it as dry sand receives water, drinking it in and holding it fast. It was slow and careful work, this teaching, and Paul went at it with the patience of the desert itself. He did not drive his pupils as the masters of Salusa Secundus drove theirs, with the whip of fear. He led them instead, showing each movement until it lived in their bodies without thought, and he learned as much from them as they learned from him. There was among these gifts one thing above all that the Fremen prized, and that was the art of the weirding way, the fighting method that his mother had brought out of the deep training of the sisterhood. To the desert people it seemed almost a kind of sorcery, this way of moving that made a warrior into something swift and certain and very nearly untouchable. Paul and his mother taught it patiently, breaking it into pieces the tribes could master, and the young Fremen learned it with a speed that astonished even those who taught them. For their bodies were already the finest instruments imaginable, shaped from birth by a world that punished the smallest weakness, and they needed only the final knowledge to become something the universe had no answer for. Among his first and fiercest pupils were the men who would become his captains. There was Stilgar, the grave and honorable leader of the Sietch that had taken him in, a man of deep wisdom and deeper loyalty, who came in time to follow Muad'Dib not from fear, but from a chosen faith. There was Chani, the desert woman, who became dear to Paul beyond all others, herself a warrior of great skill, a daughter of the sand who fought at his side. And there were the death commandos, the fierce companions called the Fedaykin, who swore themselves to Muad'Dib and pledged their lives to his cause, taking as their name the old word for those who give their lives, and asking nothing in return but the freedom of Arrakis. The training went on across the deep desert, hidden from the eyes of the Harkonnens and the Emperor alike. In the great caverns of the Sietches, in the folds of the rock where no off-world patrol ever ventured, the Fremen practiced the arts of Muad'Dib. They drilled with the crysknife and with the Maula pistol, and they learned to hold their fire and their patience until the perfect moment. They mastered the raids that struck at the spice harvest, appearing out of the open sand as if the desert itself had risen up, striking swiftly and vanishing again before the slow imperial machinery could turn to answer them. Every raid taught them, and every raid took its toll upon the enemy, and slowly the Harkonnens began to understand that something in the desert was hunting them, though they could not say what it was. Yet the greater work was not the fighting alone. It was the uniting. For the Fremen had always been a people of many tribes, each Sietch a world unto itself, each community proud and separate and slow to trust its neighbors. Across the long centuries they had shared a way of life and a hatred of their oppressors. But they had never been one people under one banner. And without that unity, all their skill was scattered like water spilled upon the sand. Paul understood that the true weapon he must forge was not any single warrior, but the whole desert nation, drawn together at last into a single will. And so he traveled, siege by siege, across the vast and hidden geography of the deep desert. He proved himself before each tribe in the way the desert demanded, through courage and through skill and through the strange authority that grew about him season by season. Word ran ahead of him, carried on the night wind, of the off-world prince who fought like a storm and who spoke of a green Arrakis, a world made living again, a paradise the Fremen had dreamed of in secret for numberless generations. Tribe by tribe, they gave him their allegiance, until the man who had come to the desert with nothing stood as the acknowledged leader of a people no power in the Imperium had ever managed to conquer. Season by season the host grew, and season by season its skill deepened. The young warriors who had first come to Muad'Dib as pupils became teachers themselves, carrying the arts back to their own sieges, so that the knowledge spread across the desert like water finding every hidden channel in the rock. What one tribe learned, all tribes came in time to share, and this too was part of the uniting, for a common training bound the scattered peoples as surely as a shared purpose. There was a moment that sealed this, deep in the story of his rising, when Paul went out alone upon the open sand to do the thing that only a true Fremen could do, and by doing it, proved himself beyond any further doubt. But even setting that aside, the great transformation was plain to all who had eyes to see it. Where once there had been scattered bands raiding at the edges, now there was a disciplined force, tens of thousands strong and more, spread across the whole planet, sharing a single training, a single purpose, and a single leader. They were still Fremen, still shaped by the desert and its harsh code. But now they were also an army, and an army the like of which the galaxy had forgotten was possible. The Emperor upon his distant throne still knew nothing of what grew in the sand. His records counted the Fremen at a few paltry tens of thousands, a scattered remnant of little account, and even that count was a shadow of the truth. In the deep desert, their numbers ran to millions, and among those millions, Muad'Dib had raised a fighting host tempered by their world and sharpened by the lost arts of the sisterhood and the great houses. They wanted nothing that the throne could give them, and feared nothing that the throne could threaten, and that made them free in a way no imperial soldier had ever been. The desert had made the finest raw warriors in the universe. Paul Atreides had made them into a legion, and the legion was almost ready. Up next in Chapter 15, Sardaukar against Fremen, will set the Emperor's dreaded troops against the desert warriors at last, and feel the growing certainty that the long legend of imperial invincibility was about to break upon the sands of Arrakis. For all the long years of the Imperium, one certainty had stood above every other, quiet and unquestioned, holding the whole order of the stars in its place. The certainty was this, that the Sardaukar of the Padishah Emperor could not be beaten. They were the soldier fanatics of Salusa Secundus, the gray-clad terror whose very name silenced the councils of the great houses. And in 10,000 years of imperial rule, no force had ever met them in open battle and lived to boast of it. That single fact was the ground on which the throne rested. Now, on the sands of Arrakis, that ground was about to give way, though almost no one in the wide universe yet suspected it. The first meetings between the two peoples were not the great battle that was still to come. They were smaller and quieter, skirmishes in the deep desert and raids upon the spice fields, and in them the Sardaukar first tasted something they had not tasted in living memory, which was the resistance of an enemy who did not break. When the Emperor lent his troops in secret to the Harkonnens, disguising them in the colors of that cruel house, they had expected to sweep the desert clean of its vermin as they had swept away House Atreides in a single night. They set about their work with the cold confidence of soldiers who had never known defeat. But the Fremen did not fight as other peoples fought, and the Sardaukar, for all their terror, had never faced anything like them. The imperial troops were used to enemies who met them in the open, in ordered ranks upon known ground, where discipline and ferocity would always tell. The Fremen gave them nothing to strike. They rose out of the sand, where no army could possibly be hidden, struck with a speed and precision that left no time to answer, and were gone again into the shimmering distance before the dead had even fallen. The desert itself seemed to fight for them, the heat and the thirst, and the endless killing dryness wearing at the imperial soldiers even when no Fremen was in sight. And when blade did meet blade, the Sardaukar made a discovery that unsettled them deeply, though they were far too proud to speak of it. In the individual clash of warrior against warrior, the thing that no army had managed for 100 generations began to happen. The Fremen were their equals, worse than equals. Where the Sardaukar had been hardened by the cruelty of a prison world, the Fremen had been forged by a world crueler still. A desert that killed without mercy or pause, and that gave no second chances to the slow or the weak. Every Fremen who had lived to become a warrior had already survived a training ground harsher than Salusa Secundus, and had done so not for a season, but for a whole life, from the first breath onward. There is a thing the Sardaukar came to understand in those bitter skirmishes, though they would not admit it aloud, and it was a simple and terrible arithmetic. It took the prison world of the Emperor a great cost in bodies to produce a single Sardaukar. On Salusa Secundus, a large portion of those sent there died young, and only a fraction survived to be trained. And of those, a smaller fraction still became the finished soldiers of the gray ranks. The desert of Arrakis was crueler even than that, and yet the Fremen were not the survivors of a culling imposed by an emperor. They were an entire people, every man and woman among them a warrior by necessity, numbering not in the tens of thousands, but in the millions. The emperor had built his terror at enormous cost from a prison of the condemned. The desert had built an equal terror, freely and completely, out of an entire living nation. It was a hardness that could not be taught and could not be bought, and the Sardaukar, who had believed themselves the hardest men alive, met it now and did not know what to make of it. Their own ferocity had always been enough, in every battle across 10,000 years, to carry them through. Against the Fremen, it was met and matched and quietly surpassed, and there was no answer for that in all their training, because their training had never imagined an enemy who had suffered more than they had suffered, and endured more than they had endured. The Fremen had been made hard by a world, and a world is a sterner master than any throne. Word of this began, very slowly, to trouble the confidence of those who commanded the imperial forces. Reports came back from Arrakis that did not fit the comfortable old certainties. Sardaukar were dying, and not by ones and twos to accident or ambush, but in numbers, and to an enemy they could not find and could not name. The Fremen took their toll and vanished, and each time they came again, they were more numerous and more skilled, as though the desert bred them faster than the imperial blades could cut them down. The Harkonnens, who had believed the planet firmly theirs, found their spice harvest falling and their outlying garrisons going silent, and they had no true understanding of the force that was rising against them. Behind it all stood Muad'Dib, and this too the Emperor did not understand. The imperial powers still thought of the desert resistance, when they thought of it at all, as a nuisance of scattered raiders. They did not know that a single will now bound the tribes together, that the man they had thought dead in the ruin of House Atreides was alive in the deep desert, that he had taken the finest raw warriors in the universe and given them the lost arts of the sisterhood and the great houses, and that he was choosing, with the patience of the sand, the hour of his reckoning. The trap was closing, and those inside it did not yet feel the walls. There was a cruel irony in it that the years would make plain. The very act by which the Emperor had shown his power, the secret lending of his Sardaukar to destroy Duke Leto, was the act that had cast Paul Atreides into the desert, where he had found the one people capable of undoing the throne. The demonstration of Sardaukar supremacy had planted the seed of Sardaukar defeat. The Grey soldiers who had come to Arrakis to prove that nothing could stand against the Emperor were, without knowing it, the ones who had delivered his undoing into the hands of the sand. And there was one weapon still that the Fremen held in reserve, one thing that no Sardaukar and no imperial mind had ever reckoned with, because it belonged to no army that had ever existed. The Fremen alone, of all the peoples of the universe, had learned the secret of the great worms of Arrakis, the vast and terrible creatures of the deep desert that could swallow a spice crawler whole. Where every other power on the planet fled the worms in terror, the Fremen summoned them and rode upon their backs, mounting the most dangerous living things in all the known worlds and turning them into war beasts. No shield, no fortress, no formation of Grey soldiers had ever been built to withstand the coming of the worms, for no enemy had ever ridden them into war. That reckoning was still to come. So the stage was quietly set, out beyond the sight of the Golden Throne, upon the endless sands that the Imperium had always despised. On one side stood the Sardaukar, the terror of 10,000 years, still clad in the certainty that they could not be beaten, still holding up the whole weight of the imperial order upon the reputation of their invincibility. On the other side stood the Fremen, a people the universe had overlooked, forged by a world harsher than any prison, sharpened by an exiled prince, uncounted and unafraid, waiting in the deep desert for the storm to come. The long legend was about to be tested, and the sand already knew how the testing would end. Up next in Chapter 16, the battle for Arrakis will come at last to the great confrontation, the Fremen riding the worms through the Emperor's own forces, the storm and the sand rising together, and the shattering of the Sardaukar, who had never truly been beaten before. At last, the hour came that the desert had been quietly preparing for, across all the long seasons of Muad'Dib's rising. The Padishah Emperor himself came to Arrakis, drawn there by the failing spice and the disorder no one could explain, and he brought with him the full weight of his terror. He landed upon the desert in an enormous vessel, and around it he raised a great encampment of metal and ordered strength, and within that camp he gathered legions of his Sardaukar, the Grey soldiers who had never lost, together with the household of the Harkonnens and the watching lords of the Landsraad. The Emperor believed he had come to end a nuisance. He had come, though he did not know it, to the undoing of his own throne. The Fremen, for their part, had been waiting for exactly this. They had drawn the whole strength of the tribes together. Tens upon tens of thousands of desert warriors gathered from every sietch, tempered by their world and sharpened by the arts of Muad'Dib. And they had done so without the Emperor's watchers ever grasping the truth. And they had one thing more, the great gift of the deep desert, held back until this final day. Far out upon the open sand, where the imperial camp lay before the shelter of the mountains, a Coriolis storm was rising, one of the vast walls of wind that swept across Arrakis with a force that could strip the flesh from bone and tear apart the strongest machine. The Fremen had watched the weather with the patience of a people who read the sky as others read a page, and they had chosen this day because the storm was coming, and because the storm was their ally. When the moment came, it came with the fury of the whole planet behind it. The great storm broke upon the imperial camp and shattered the protective barriers that stood between the Emperor's forces and the open desert. The shields that guarded the encampment could turn a blade or a blast, but they could do nothing against the wind and the driving sand. And the storm rolled over the metal walls and threw them down. And out of that storm, riding upon it, borne forward on the very front of the tempest, came the thing that no army in the history of the universe had ever been made to face. The Fremen came riding the worms. Out of the deep desert they summoned the great makers, the vast creatures that no other people had ever tamed, and they mounted them by the score and drove them forward through the wall of the storm and into the heart of the Emperor's camp. The ground itself seemed to rise and move. Where the gray soldiers looked for an enemy in ordered ranks, they saw instead the desert lifting up in enormous living shapes, the worms breaking through the sand with the Fremen upon their backs, and behind and around them the desert warriors on foot, uncounted, appearing out of the storm as if the planet had at last chosen to defend its own. It was a sight to break the nerve of any soldier, and even the Sardaukar, who had never known fear, felt something they had no name for. The battle that followed was swift and terrible, and it is told here softly, for there is sorrow in it, as there is sorrow in the fall of any people who believed themselves invincible. The Sardaukar fought as they had always fought, with the cold ferocity that had made them the terror of 10,000 years. And they did not surrender, and they did not flee. But this time it was not enough, and for the first time in living memory, it was not nearly enough. The Fremen met them warrior against warrior, and proved the harder people, blade against blade. And where the gray soldiers had always found their enemies breaking before them, now it was the Fremen who did not break, and could not be made to break, because they were fighting for their own world upon the sand that had made them. The worms rolled through the encampment, and the barriers that had held back the desert were gone, and the storm covered everything in a howling veil of sand. In that chaos, the great certainty of the Imperium came apart. The soldiers who had never been beaten were beaten. The gray ranks that had held up the whole order of the stars, simply upon the weight of their reputation, were scattered and thrown down upon the open desert, and there was no reserve to call and no legend left to lean upon, because the legend itself was dying there in the sand. The Emperor watched from within his great vessel as the impossible unfolded before him, as the vermin he had come to cull swept away the finest soldiers he possessed, and the certainty of a lifetime drained from him like water spilled upon the dunes. At the head of it all rode Muad'Dib, the exiled boy of Caladan, who was now the acknowledged leader of the desert nation, the prophet and the warlord of the Fremen. He led them not from behind, but into the heart of the storm, and the young men and women he had trained fought around him with the arts he had given them, and the death commandos who had sworn their lives to his cause spent those lives without a moment's hesitation to break the Emperor's power. The city of Arrakis, the seat of rule upon the planet, fell to the desert warriors, and with it fell the last defense of the throne upon Arrakis. When the storm at last began to fade, and the sand settled once more into stillness, the field belonged to the Fremen, and the Sardaukar, who had never truly been beaten before, lay broken upon a world they had come to conquer. In the long history that followed, storytellers would return again and again to that day, trying to understand how the impossible had been made to happen. Some spoke of the storm, and some of the worms, and some of the courage of the desert warriors, and all of these were true. But the deepest truth was quieter than any of them. The Sardaukar had been beaten before the first blade was drawn, beaten by the simple fact that they had come to fight upon a world that belonged to their enemy, against a people who knew every dune and every wind, and every hidden path of it, and who would sooner die than yield it. No amount of terror could overcome that, and no reputation could stand against it. There was grief in the victory, as there is grief in all victories, and the Fremen knew it. They had lost their own brave men and women of the Sietches who would ride the worms no more, and they mourned them in the way of the desert, gathering even the water of the fallen, wasting nothing, honoring the dead, by carrying their moisture home to the tribe. It was a quiet grief and a deep one, and it stood in the stillness after the storm like the hush that follows a great labor. But mingled with the grief was something the Fremen had waited numberless generations to feel, which was the knowledge that their world was, at last, their own, that the boots of the off-worlders had been thrown down into the sand, and that no army in all the universe now stood above them. And so the thing that could not happen had happened. The Sardaukar, the terror of the Imperium, the grey soldiers whose reputation had held the great houses in check for 10,000 years, had been shattered upon the sands of Arrakis by a people the whole universe had chosen to overlook. The throne that had rested upon their invincibility rested upon nothing now, for the invincibility was gone, spent and scattered in a single storm. The desert had kept its long secret to the very end, and then it had spoken, and the order of the stars would never again be what it had been before that day. The finest soldiers the universe had ever known had proven, at last, exactly who they were. Up next, in Chapter 17, Why the Fremen Won, we'll look gently beneath the surface of that great victory, past the numbers and the surprise, to the deeper hardness and unity of purpose that let a people the Imperium had scorned overcome the most feared soldiers in all the known worlds. When the dust of Arrakis at last began to settle, and the great worms turned back toward the deep desert, and the shattered banners of the Emperor lay half buried in the sand, a quiet question hung over the whole of the known universe. It was not a loud question, and it did not demand an answer all at once. It drifted, slow and patient, the way heat rises from the dunes at day's close. How had this happened? How had the Sardaukar, the terror troops of the Fedaykin Emperor, the finest soldiers anyone had ever known, been broken by a people the Imperium had never bothered to count? Tonight, we sit with that question, gently, and let its answer come to us, the way understanding comes in the last soft hour before sleep, arriving on its own. The easy answers came first, as easy answers always do. Some said the Fremen had simply been more numerous than anyone had guessed, hidden away in their Sietches beneath the rock. And it was true that their numbers had been badly counted, that the whole Imperium had imagined a scattered handful of desert wanderers, where in fact there were millions. But numbers alone do not break an empire. History was full of great hosts that had crumbled before smaller, harder ones. The truth ran deeper than any counting, down beneath the sand, into the very way these people had been made. Others said it was surprise, the shock of the worms rising through the dust, the storm that swept the shields away, the strangeness of an enemy who fought in ways no manual had prepared for. And there was truth in this as well. The Emperor's men had never imagined cavalry that came coiling up out of the ground itself, vast and ancient and unstoppable. But surprise fades in an afternoon. A soldier feels it, then steadies, then fights on. Surprise could win a single charge. It could not, on its own, unmake the balance of 1,000 worlds. The Fremen victory was not a lucky accident of one wild morning. It was the slow harvest of a hardness that had been growing for a very long time. To understand why the Fremen won, one had to set the two peoples side by side and look calmly at how each had been shaped. The Sardaukar had been forged by cruelty on the prison world of Salusa Secundus, where a harsh sky and a merciless order killed the weak and left only the fierce. Their strength was real. No one who had faced them ever doubted it. but it was a strength that had been given to them from above, poured into them by an emperor who needed weapons, and it depended, always, on that emperor and his rewards, his coin, his favor, his throne. The Sardaukar fought because they were paid and honored and feared, and because the machine that made them told them to. Their loyalty was fierce, but it was a loyalty bought and drilled into them, hanging from the outside like armor. The Fremen had been forged by their own world and by nothing else. No emperor had built them. No empire had trained them or paid them or promised them anything at all. Arrakis had made them, the deep desert with its killing heat and its endless thirst. And they had answered it, not out of obedience, but out of the plain need to live. Every one of them, from the smallest child to the oldest Nayab, had learned the desert's lessons in their own flesh, because the desert did not forgive a single careless step. This was the first and deepest reason the Fremen won. Their hardness was not lent to them. It was their own, grown from the inside, rooted so deep that no defeat and no fear could tear it loose. There was a second reason, and it lay in the matter of purpose. The Sardaukar fought for an emperor far away on a green and pleasant world, for a throne that most of them would never see, for an idea of imperial power that had grown soft and comfortable at its center. Their cause was the keeping of an order that already held everything it wanted. But the Fremen fought for their own lives, for their own children, for the water in their tribes and the dream of a green Arrakis that their hearts had carried across generations. When a Fremen stood upon the sand and faced the Emperor's finest, he was not defending a distant crown. He was defending everything he had ever loved. And a warrior who fights for his own home and his own people carries within him a fierceness that no wage and no drill can ever match. There was a third reason, and it was the reason of the ground beneath their feet. The Sardaukar had come to Arrakis as strangers in their gray uniforms, on a world whose heat sapped them, and whose sand blinded them, and whose great worms terrified them. Every advantage they had known on other battlefields was stripped away here. But the Fremen were of this place. The desert that punished the outsider sheltered the Fremen. They knew where the water hid and where the storms would rise, and how to move across the open dunes without being seen. They vanished into the sand and appeared again where no enemy expected them. The very world that broke the Emperor's men was, for the Fremen, a familiar and faithful thing, an ally older than any empire. And there was a fourth reason, quieter than the others, and perhaps the truest. It lay in the softness that had crept, over long centuries, into the edges of the Imperium. The great houses had grown comfortable. The Emperor's court had grown certain of itself. Even the Sardaukar, terrible as they were, had come to rest upon their own legend, upon the fear their name inspired, upon the belief that no one would ever dare to stand against them. They had won for so long that they had half forgotten what it was to be truly tested. The Fremen had never been given the luxury of comfort. There were no soft edges anywhere in their lives. They had been tested every single day by thirst and heat and the ever-present nearness of death, and so when the true test came at last, on the field before Arrakis, they met it as they met every dawn, with a readiness that had never once been allowed to fade. Put all four together, and the mystery dissolved like morning mist. It was not one thing that carried the day. It was hardness grown from within, purpose rooted in love of home, mastery of the ground itself, and a discipline that comfort had never softened. The Sardaukar had been the finest weapon the Imperium could forge. But the Fremen were not a weapon at all. They were a whole people who had become warriors simply by surviving, And against a people like that, the pampered strength of an empire had no true answer. It is worth pausing, too, on how naturally these reasons wove together, each strengthening the others until they became a single thing. The hardness grown from within gave the Fremen their unshakable spirit. Their love of home gave that spirit a purpose no coin could match. Their mastery of the sand turned that purpose into deadly skill upon the ground itself. And the absence of any softness kept every part of it sharp and ready, tested afresh with each rising sun. It was not four separate advantages laid side by side. It was one whole way of being, a people made entire by their world, and against such a people an empire built of borrowed strength could not, in the end, prevail. There is something gentle in this when you rest with it long enough. It says that the loudest reputation is not always the deepest truth, and that quiet endurance, grown slowly and honestly over long, hard years, can outlast the proudest power in the stars. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Let the four reasons drift together into one soft understanding, and let it settle over you like a warm blanket in a cooling room. Up next, in Chapter 18, The Warriors Who Broke an Empire, we will step back and look, with wonder and with calm, at the whole astonishing fact of it, how a people the universe had overlooked reached up from the sand and remade the order of the stars, simply by being the finest soldiers who ever lived. Let us step back now, softly, the way a traveler pauses at the crest of a great dune to look at the whole land spread out behind him. We have followed the story down through all its turns, from the gray uniforms of the Sardaukar to the crisp knives of the desert, and now we can hold the whole of it in one quiet gaze. And when we do, one thing rises above all the rest, plain and astonishing and gentle at once. A people the entire universe had overlooked reached up out of the sand and toppled a Padisha emperor and remade the order of the stars. Tonight we simply sit with the wonder of that and let it carry us, unhurried, toward rest. Consider, first, how small the Fremen had seemed to everyone who mattered. For thousands of years, the great powers of the Imperium had traded and schemed over Arrakis, drawn there by the spice that lay hidden in its sands, the most precious substance in all the known worlds. They built their cities and their spaceports on the planet's edges. They flew above its deserts and looked down upon the endless dunes and saw, they believed, an empty and worthless waste. The desert people, when the powerful thought of them at all, were counted as scattered savages, a scattering of ragged wanderers hardly worth the naming. No house kept a true count of them. No emperor feared them. They were a footnote, a rumor, a thing at the far edge of every map. And yet, it was these overlooked people, and no one else, who did what no great house in the whole long history of the Imperium had ever managed to do. The mightiest families of the Landsraad had schemed for ages to check the Emperor's power, and none had ever broken it. The balance of the stars had rested, quiet and unshaken, upon the throne and its terrible soldiers, for longer than most could remember. Kings and duchesses and barons had risen and fallen within that order, but the order itself had held, vast and seemingly eternal. It was not the proud and the powerful who at last cracked it open. It was a people with no fleet, no great cities, no spice wealth of their own, no name that carried weight in any court. It was the Fremen. There is a particular kind of wonder in that, the kind that softens the heart rather than quickens it. For it tells us that greatness does not always come dressed as we expect. The whole Imperium had looked for its strongest warriors among the grand and the feared, among the trained legions and the honored houses. And all the while the finest soldiers who ever lived were out on the open sand, wrapped in dust-colored cloth, drinking the recaptured water of their own breath, hidden in caves beneath the rock, waiting, though they did not know for what. The strength that would remake the stars had been there all along, quietly ripening in the last place anyone thought to look. Think, too, of what it meant to break not merely an army, but an entire order. When the Sardaukar were shattered before Arrakis, it was not only soldiers who fell that day. It was the whole structure of belief that had held the Imperium together. For countless generations, the great houses had obeyed the Emperor because they believed his terror troops could not be beaten. That belief was the true foundation of his power, more than any law or treaty. Fear, quiet and constant, had kept 1,000 worlds in their places. And when the Fremen proved, once and for all, that the unbeatable could be beaten, that belief crumbled, and with it the whole long piece of dread that had rested upon it. The Order of the Stars did not simply change hands. Its deepest assumption was undone, and the ones who undid it asked for so little of the glory that usually follows such deeds. The Fremen had not set out to rule the galaxy. They were not conquerors by hunger or by pride. They had wanted, most of all, water and freedom and the slow green dream of a living Arrakis. They had spent their strength not to seize the stars, but to defend their sieges and their children and their way of being. That the fate of an empire turned upon them was almost a thing that happened alongside their true purpose. A vast consequence of a people simply refusing to be broken. There is a deep humility in that, and humility, held gently at the end of a long day, is one of the most restful things there is. We should be honest, too, about what made them worthy of the wonder. It was not luck, though luck played its small part, as it does in all things. It was that they were, in the plainest and truest sense, the finest soldiers who had ever lived. Every measure by which one might weigh a warrior, they carried further than any army before them. In endurance, they had no equal, for they had learned to live where water itself was the rarest of treasures. In discipline, none could match them, for their self-control had been shaped by a world that killed the careless. In courage, they stood beyond all others, for they had made their peace with death long before any battle, and so faced it without the trembling that unmakes lesser men. In skill upon their own ground, they were simply supreme. Set all of that within a single people, and you have a force the universe had never seen and might never see again. And so the wonder is not that they won. Looked at rightly, from the crest of the dune with the whole land spread below, it is almost strange that anyone ever doubted they could. The wonder is that they existed at all, that such a people had been quietly formed, unnoticed, in the harshest corner of the harshest world, and that when the hour came, they were ready. The Imperium had built its terror troops on purpose, at great cost, through cruelty and design. The desert had made something greater by accident, or perhaps by a patience deeper than any design, asking nothing, promising nothing, simply shaping its children year upon year until they became the strongest thing beneath the stars. It is worth lingering, too, on how little the great powers understood of what was happening even as it happened. The Emperor came to Arrakis certain of his terror troops, certain a show of force would settle the matter as it always had. The Baron schemed in his old familiar ways, weighing spice and coin and the favor of the throne, blind to the true weight gathering out on the sand. Not one of them grasped that the balance of the whole Imperium had already begun to shift beneath their feet, quietly, grain by grain, out where no one was looking. And this is often how the largest changes come, not with a warning that all can read, but slowly and unseen, so that the powerful discover the ground has moved only when they are already falling. There is a lesson folded into all of this, though it is a soft one, meant more for comfort than for study. It is that the world often keeps its truest strength in its quietest places. The thing that shakes the heavens may be sitting, unregarded, at the edge of every map, in the overlooked and the unnamed and the seemingly small. Power announces itself with banners and fear and grand parades, but the deepest strength is often silent and patient and content to wait until the day it is needed, and then it rises, and the whole order of things is changed. You may carry that thought gently down into sleep, or you may let it go entirely. Either way, it will keep. So, we let the wonder settle. A people no one counted broke the mightiest empire the stars had ever known, not through cruelty or hunger for power, but simply by being, in the end, the finest soldiers who ever lived. Rest with the largeness of that, and let it grow soft and warm as it sinks toward the quiet floor of your mind. Up next, in Chapter 19, What Truly Makes a Great Soldier, we will answer, plainly and calmly, the question that has carried us through the whole of this telling, and see why the Fremen, forged by their desert and their discipline, surpassed even the feared Sardaukar. We come now, gently, to the question that has walked beside us through this whole long telling, the question the very title of our story asked: what truly makes a great soldier? For many years the answer had seemed settled, plain as the gray of a Sardaukar uniform. A great soldier was the most feared, the most brutal, the most perfectly hardened weapon an empire could forge. And yet the desert had offered a different answer, and tonight we sit with both, and let the truer one rise softly on its own, the way an answer arrives in the last drowsy moments before rest. Begin with what the old answer had believed. The Sardaukar were the finest that cruelty could make. They were the proof of what happens when you take strong material and break it and reforge it under a merciless sky, when you strip away every softness and pour in discipline and fear until only the weapon remains. On the prison world of Salusa Secundus, the weak died and the fierce survived, and from the survivors the emperor drew his terror troops. This was strength, real and undeniable, and no one who has heard this story should imagine otherwise. The Sardaukar were magnificent in their terrible way, but they were also the answer to a narrow question. They answered only this: how do you build the deadliest weapon? And a weapon, however deadly, is not the whole of a soldier. For the desert offered a wider question, and a wider answer with it. It asked not how to build a weapon, but how a people becomes strong, and it answered across three quiet truths. Three things that the Fremen carried, and the Sardaukar, for all their terror, did not. The first was terrain. The second was purpose. And the third, deepest of all, was spirit. Let us hold each one in turn, softly, and see how it shone. Consider terrain first. A great soldier is not a thing that floats free of the ground he stands upon. He is joined to his world, to the land that shaped him, and the land he fights across. The Sardaukar had been trained to fight anywhere, and this had made them formidable, but it had also made them belong to no place at all. When they came to Arrakis, the desert was their enemy as surely as the Fremen were, sapping them with heat, blinding them with sand, filling them with dread of the great worms. But the Fremen were of the desert, woven into it, so deeply at home that the very ground fought on their side. They knew where the water hid and where the wind would turn, and how to cross the open dunes unseen. To be a great soldier, the desert taught, is in part to belong somewhere so completely that the world itself becomes an ally. Mastery of terrain is not a small skill added on at the end. It is a root. And the Fremen were rooted where the Sardaukar merely stood. Consider purpose next, for it runs deeper than terrain. A soldier fights for something. and what he fights for shapes the whole strength of his fighting. The Sardaukar fought for an emperor far away, for coin and honor and the keeping of a comfortable throne. Their purpose came from outside them, handed down, a duty owed to a distant power. It was a strong purpose, but a borrowed one, and a borrowed purpose can be spent, can tire, can waver when the reward grows uncertain. The Fremen fought for their own lives and their own children and the green dream of their world, and this purpose was not borrowed at all. It rose from within them, from everything they loved. A soldier who fights for his own home carries a fire that no wage can light and no defeat can easily put out. This was the second truth. That purpose grown from love is greater than purpose paid for with fear, and that the deepest strength belongs to those who fight for what is truly their own. And consider spirit, the third truth and the highest. Beneath terrain and purpose there lies something quieter still, the inward temper of a people, the way they meet hardship and death, and the long grind of endurance. The Sardaukar had been given a fierce spirit through cruelty, broken and remade by pain until fear itself had been burned out of them. It was a spirit forged from the outside by force. The Fremen spirit was grown from the inside, slowly, honestly, across a lifetime, in a world that punished every mistake. They had made their peace with death not because someone drilled it into them, but because the desert had asked it of them every single day. And they had answered, and answered, until calm in the face of death was simply who they were. Their discipline was not imposed, it was theirs. Their courage was not manufactured. It had grown, and a spirit grown from within is stronger than any spirit hammered in from without, because it needs no master to sustain it, and no reward and no fear. It stands on its own. Put the three together, terrain and purpose and spirit, and you have the true answer the desert had been offering all along. A great soldier is not merely the deadliest weapon that cruelty can shape. A great soldier is one who belongs to his ground, who fights for what he loves, and who carries a strength grown honestly from the inside, needing no master to hold it up. By that measure, the Sardaukar, for all their terror, were surpassed. They had reputation, and they had brutality, and these had carried them far. But the Fremen had the deeper things, and the deeper things won. It helps to see how these three truths answer the very things the old belief had prized. The old belief prized the deadliness of the weapon, and the truth of terrain answered that a warrior cut off from his ground is only half as strong. It prized loyalty drilled in by fear, and the truth of purpose answered that devotion freely given, rising from love, will always outlast obedience bought with dread. It prized the fierce spirit hammered in through cruelty, and the truth of spirit answered that a temper grown honestly from within needs no master and can never be taken away. The Sardaukar had been shaped to be feared. The Fremen had been shaped by their own world and their own choosing to endure and to belong and to stand. And when the two were set at last against each other, it was the deeper shaping that held. Notice, too, that not one of these three truths depends upon cruelty. Terrain is a matter of belonging, purpose a matter of love, and spirit, at its truest, a matter of quiet steadiness grown over time. From an unwilling teacher, harsh but never malicious, the Fremen had drawn a greatness that cruelty, for all its terrible efficiency, had never managed to match. There is a great comfort in this answer when you rest with it, for it says that the truest strength is not the loudest or the cruelest, that the thing everyone fears is not always the thing that endures, and that the qualities which make a soul strong are not violence and dread, but belonging and love, and a quiet steadiness grown from the inside. The Fremen were terrible in battle, yes, but what made them great was not their terror. It was their rootedness, their devotion, and the calm, unbreakable spirit they had grown for themselves, out on the sand where no one thought to look. And so, the question the title asked is answered, softly and fully. What truly makes a great soldier is not cruelty, and not reputation, and not the fear a name inspires. It is terrain, and purpose, and spirit, the ground beneath the feet, the love within the heart, and the strength that rises from within. By these the Fremen surpassed the finest weapon an empire could forge, and by these they broke the order of the stars. You need not hold on to any of it. Let the three truths drift together into one gentle understanding, and let that understanding rest warm upon you as the room grows dim. Up next, in Chapter 20, The Quiet Strength of the Desert, we will let the story come softly to its close, and rest at last upon the endurance and the unity of the desert and its people, and let it carry you gently all the way down towards sleep. And so we come, at last, to the quiet place where all our telling has been leading, not to another battle, and not to another turning of the great wheel of the stars, but simply to rest, out upon the open desert, in the cool and gentle hour, after everything has been said. Tonight there is nothing more to explain, and nothing more to prove. There is only the desert itself, wide and calm beneath a sky heavy with stars, and the people who belong to it, and the soft strength that held them, which we may sit with now, the way one sits with an old friend in comfortable silence, needing no words at all. Think of the desert as it truly was, when the fighting had ended, and the dust had settled, and the great worms had gone back down into the deep. The dunes lay in long, smooth curves under the starlight, endless and still, cooling slowly after the fierce heat of the day. There was a silence out there deeper than any silence in the crowded worlds of the Imperium. A silence that did not feel empty, but full, the way a held breath is full. The sand held the warmth of the sun a while longer, and then gave it up gently to the night. And across all that vastness there was a sense, quiet and unhurried, of something that had endured for a very long time, and would endure for a very long time still. That endurance was the true heart of the whole story. The Fremen had not won the stars through hunger or through pride. They had won because they had endured patiently across generations, in a place that asked everything of them and gave back only the barest chance to live. Endurance is a quiet virtue. It does not announce itself. It does not shine or boast or fill the sky with banners. It simply continues, day after day, through thirst and heat and loss, holding on, until the day comes when holding on is enough to change everything. The Fremen had held on longer and harder than anyone, and that long holding on had made them what they were. There is something deeply restful in that thought, that the greatest strength is not a sudden blaze, but a steady, patient keeping on, the kind of strength that carries a soul softly through the longest of nights. And with endurance there was unity, the second quiet strength of the desert. The Fremen were not scattered individuals, each fighting alone. They were a people, bound together by their harsh code and their shared thirst, and the water they held in common in the depths of their sietches. Each one carried the others. Each one poured his strength into the whole. When the water of a fallen tribesman was gathered and kept for the tribe, it was a sign of something that ran through everything they did, that no one stood truly alone, that the strength of each belonged to all. This unity was gentler than any weapon and stronger than any wall. It meant that a Fremen was never merely himself, but always part of something larger, held and holding. And it was this belonging, as much as anything, that made them unbreakable. To be woven so completely into a people is one of the deepest comforts a soul can know, and the desert had given the Fremen that comfort in full. Rest a moment on how these two things, endurance and unity, are the very opposite of the loud, fierce power we began with. We began, long chapters ago, with the Sardaukar, with terror and gray uniforms and the fear a name could cast across 1,000 worlds. That was a strength built to be seen, to be dreaded, to press upon the hearts of others. And we have ended somewhere altogether different, in a quiet strength that never sought to be feared at all, that only wished to live and to endure, and to hold its people together against a hard world. It is worth noticing, as the story closes, that the quiet strength proved the deeper one. The terror faded. The fear was broken. But the patient, unified endurance of the desert people remained, and it was that, in the end, which outlasted the mightiest empire the stars had ever known. Rest, too, upon how these quiet strengths were passed from one generation to the next, without ceremony, without any grand telling. A Fremen child learned endurance not from a lesson, but from a life, from watching the elders waste no drop of water, from feeling the desert's heat and answering it as everyone around had always answered it. Unity was not taught in words, but lived. In the sharing of the siege, in the keeping of the tribe's water, in the 1,000 small acts by which each one held the others up. And so these strengths were not fragile things that might be lost in a single hard season. They were woven into the very way of living, handed down as naturally as breath, so that each new generation received them whole and carried them forward. There is a deep steadiness in that, a sense of something that continues far beyond any single life, and it is a steadiness that soothes the heart to rest upon. There is a kindness in ending here, upon the sand, in the cool of the night. For the desert, so cruel to those who fought it, was tender to those who belonged to it. It taught its people to want little, and to hold that little dear, to move gently across the dunes, to waste nothing, to keep faith with one another. It taught them a slowness and a patience that the crowded, hurried worlds had long forgotten. And in return, it gave them a peace that no comfort could buy. The deep peace of a people who knew exactly who they were and where they belonged and what they were willing to endure. That peace is what remains, now that all the battles are told. Not the clash of arms, but the quiet afterward. Not the terror, but the stillness. Let that stillness be yours now, as the telling ends. You have followed a long road tonight, from the prison world to the deep desert, from the terror troops to the people who broke them, all the way down to this last quiet dune beneath the stars. There is nothing left that you must carry. Let the whole of it grow soft and dim, the gray uniforms and the crysknives, the worms and the storms, the great questions and their gentle answers. All of it drifting away from you now like warmth rising off the cooling sand. You do not need to remember any of it. It has done its work simply by carrying you here, to this calm and open place at the end of the day. Feel how the desert holds its people, and let yourself be held in the same way, softly, completely, asking nothing of you. Feel the endurance that needs no effort now, the long, patient strength that has become, tonight, only rest. Feel the unity of a people who are never alone, and know that you too are safe and whole, and part of something larger and kinder than the worries of any single day. The night is wide and gentle. The stars are steady overhead. The sand is warm beneath you and cooling slowly, and there is nowhere you need to go and nothing you need to do. Let your breathing slow and even as the wind moving over the dunes. Let each thought that rises settle again like sand drifting back to stillness. The desert has kept its people through every hardship, and tonight it keeps you too, quiet and unhurried, carrying you softly down and down toward the deep and peaceful sleep that has been waiting for you all along. Rest now. The story is told, and the desert is calm, and you are exactly where you need to be. Let the last of the day dissolve like mist over the sand at dawn, and let the quiet strength of the desert carry you, gently, all the way down into rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of our telling. Tonight we followed the Emperor's terror troops, the Sardaukar, from the brutal prison planet of Salusa Secundus, where they were made, to the fear they cast across the Imperium and the balance of power they kept. We watched them bring down House Atreides, and we saw the first cracks in their legend. Then we turned to the people of the deep desert, the Fremen, and learned how they were forged by Arrakis, by the discipline of water, by their fighting on the sand, and their bond with the great worms. We followed Paul among them, the training of Muad'Dib's legions, the clash of Sardaukar against Fremen, and the battle for Arrakis. And we came, at the last, to why the Fremen won, to the warriors who broke an empire, and to the quiet truth of what truly makes a great soldier. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those distant and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet desert at dawn. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.